My family called every vacation family bonding time, and then always left me at home to take care of my grandmother, the only person in the house who ever truly chose me. For years, I stayed quiet. For years, I begged to be included. This year, I stopped begging. Instead, I booked my grandmother a $32,000 private water villa in the Maldives. When my mother saw the picture of us sipping champagne in our private infinity pool, she shrieked through the phone, demanding to know how her lowly accountant daughter afforded it. Before I tell you exactly how I ruined their dream trip and exposed a crime that would leave them with nothing, just take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories where the wicked and get exactly what they deserve. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the dining room, sharp and demanding. I stood near the kitchen doorway, holding a tray of warm appetizers, watching my family celebrate a life I was only allowed to serve. We were gathered in the formal dining room of my grandmother Rose's house. It was a beautiful, sprawling colonial home that my grandmother owned, free and clear. Yet my mother Patricia and my stepfather Richard acted like they were the lords of the manor, and I was merely the hired help. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. My younger sister Brittany had just gotten engaged to Todd. Todd was a junior executive at a logistics firm who wore too much cologne and treated every conversation like a networking event. Brittany was the golden child. She had my mother's perfect blonde hair and my stepfather's unearned arrogance. I was 2 years older, dressed in a plain beige sweater, serving them bacon-wrapped scallops while they ignored my existence. Brittany held out her left hand, letting the dining room chandelier catch the light of her 2-carat diamond ring. She sighed dramatically, leaning against Todd's shoulder. "Wedding planning is already so exhausting," Brittany said, swirling her wine. "I feel like I need a vacation just to prepare for the stress of booking a venue. Todd is working so hard at the firm, and I'm just so drained from looking at floral arrangements." My mother beamed from the head of the table. Patricia had never worked a day since marrying Richard, but she always spoke as if she carried the weight of the world. "You do work hard, sweetheart," Patricia cooed. "You and Todd deserve a break before the real wedding chaos begins. Richard and I have been talking, and we decided that this family needs a proper bonding experience to celebrate your engagement." Richard stood up from his chair. He smoothed the front of his expensive blazer and tapped his wine glass with his fork. The room went silent. Even Grandma Rose, who was sitting quietly near the end of the table, looked up from her plate. "Patricia and I want to do something special," Richard announced, puffing out his chest. "We want to show Todd how we welcome people into this family. So next month we are taking a 3-week family ski trip to the Swiss Alps. We have booked a luxury chalet in Zermatt, first-class flights, private ski instructors, the works. It is going to be the trip of a lifetime." Brittany shrieked with joy. She jumped up and threw her arms around Richard's neck. Todd grinned, raising his glass in a silent toast to his future father-in-law. Patricia clapped her hands together, looking around the room to absorb the praise. I felt a sudden foolish flutter of hope in my chest. A 3-week family trip to the Swiss Alps. For years, I had watched them pack their bags for Hawaii, for Paris, for resort towns in Mexico, always finding a reason why I could not join them. But this was an engagement celebration. This was a major family milestone. Surely, this time they meant the whole family. I stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. I set the tray of appetizers down on the polished mahogany table and offered a genuine smile. "That sounds amazing," I said, my voice cutting through the celebratory chatter. "Grandma loves the snow. She has always wanted to see the Alps." "What time is our flight?" The room went dead silent. The joyous energy evaporated instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Brittany slowly lowered her arms from Richard's neck. Todd suddenly found his wineglass fascinating. Richard cleared his throat and looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother, however, did not look away. Patricia slowly set down her napkin. She looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance, the same look she gave a cashier when a coupon was rejected. "Clara," Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescending patience, "don't be ridiculous. The tickets are incredibly expensive. We cannot afford to bring everyone. You are just a lowly accountant working from home. You do not need a luxury vacation." I stood frozen. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "You said it was a family trip," I replied. Grandma and I are your family." My mother sighed heavily, as if my very existence was a burden she bravely endured. "Exactly, Clara," she snapped. "Family makes sacrifices. Someone has to stay behind to take care of Mother's medication and manage the house. Brittany and Todd are starting a new life together. They need this bonding time. You have a very flexible schedule with your little bookkeeping gig. It makes perfect sense for you to stay here." I looked at Richard. He was suddenly very interested in cutting his steak. I looked at Brittany. She rolled her eyes and muttered something to Todd about me always trying to ruin her moments. Finally, I looked at Grandma Rose. Her frail hands were trembling slightly in her lap. She met my gaze, and in her soft, tired eyes, I saw an ocean of sorrow. She knew exactly what they were doing. She had seen them do it 100 times before. I did not scream. I did not throw my tray across the room. I simply reached out, picked up my mother's empty salad plate, and turned back toward the kitchen. "Of course," I said quietly. "I understand." I walked into the kitchen and let the swinging door close behind me, sealing out the sound of their returning laughter. I stood at the sink, running the hot water over my hands until they turned red, letting the physical pain distract me from the emotional sting. I had been doing this for 10 years. 10 years of playing the obedient, invisible daughter. When I was 22, my biological father passed away, leaving nothing but debts. Patricia married Richard shortly after moving him and his golden daughter Brittany into my grandmother's home. From the moment they crossed the threshold, I was demoted from family member to unpaid staff. I cooked the holiday meals. I polished the silver. I scrubbed the baseboards before Patricia hosted her social club luncheons. When Grandma Rose's health began to decline, requiring daily medication management and physical therapy exercises, Patricia declared that caring for her own mother was simply too exhausting. The responsibility fell entirely on me. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a failure. Patricia loved to tell her friends that I was a struggling part-time clerk who barely made minimum wage doing basic data entry. She loved the narrative of the tragic, unsuccessful older daughter, contrasting it beautifully with Brittany's glamorous life. But Patricia did not know the truth. I was an accountant, yes, but I was not a lowly bookkeeper. I was a senior forensic financial auditor for a major corporate firm. I worked completely remote, analyzing complex financial structures, tracking embezzled funds, and untangling offshore accounts for Fortune 500 companies. I billed out at $250 an hour. My actual income was nearly 3 times what Richard brought home from his mid-level management job. I hid every single penny. I drove a 10-year-old Toyota with a dented bumper. I wore cardigans from thrift stores. I bought my groceries on sale. I kept my money locked away in secure high-yield investment accounts under a secondary banking institution they knew nothing about. I hid my wealth because I knew exactly who my mother and stepfather were. If Patricia knew I had money, she would have bled me dry. She would have demanded I pay rent to live in my own grandmother's house. She would have guilted me into funding Brittany's extravagant lifestyle. I stayed invisible because it was the only armor I had. More importantly, I stayed in that house because of Grandma Rose. She was 82 years old and legally owned the property, but she was too gentle and too tired to fight back against Patricia's aggressive dominance. I knew that if I moved out into a luxury apartment and lived the life I could easily afford, Patricia would shove Grandma Rose into a low-income nursing home and take over the property completely. I endured the disrespect, the insults, and the constant exclusion, solely to serve as a human shield between my grandmother and the wolves living in her house. I finished washing the plates and dried my hands on a kitchen towel. Through the door, I could hear Richard bragging about the ski resort. He was loudly describing the heated floors, the private chefs, and the vintage wine cellars they would be enjoying. Let them have their trip, I told myself. It was just another 3 weeks of peace and quiet for me and Grandma. I did not know it yet, but their arrogant display of wealth was built on a foundation of sand. I did not know that while I was washing their dishes, the evidence of a massive, devastating crime was sitting less than 50 feet away from me, hidden in the dark bottom drawer of Richard's office desk. I did not know that by tomorrow morning the role of the quiet, obedient daughter would be gone forever. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my cheap, beige sweater, and prepared to go back out there to serve dessert to the people who despised me. I thought I knew the depths of their selfishness, but the truth, waiting for me in the shadows, was far more sinister than a simple family vacation. The house finally settled into a heavy quiet around midnight. The celebratory dinner had concluded hours ago, ending with Brittany dragging Todd out the front door, her voice echoing down the street as she listed all the designer boutiques they needed to visit before their Alpine getaway. Patricia and Richard had retired to the master bedroom, leaving behind a dining room that looked like a battleground of crystal-stained napkins and half-empty wine bottles. As usual, I was the one left to restore order to their chaotic world. I loaded the dishwasher, scrubbed the countertops until my knuckles ached, and packed away the leftover food. Every physical motion was an automatic response born from a decade of conditioning. I moved through my grandmother Rose's house like a ghost, silently erasing the traces of the people who treated me like dirt. But my duties did not end in the kitchen. Tuesday nights meant it was time to clean Richard's home office. He insisted on a strict schedule. He claimed he needed a pristine environment to manage his very important investments. A laughable statement considering he was a mid-level manager who spent most of his evenings playing online poker and drinking scotch. Still, I knew the rules. If the office was not dusted, vacuumed, and perfectly arranged by Wednesday morning, Patricia would throw a tantrum. She would threaten to cut off the household grocery budget, the same budget I secretly supplemented with my own hidden income, to ensure Grandma Rose received the fresh organic produce her delicate stomach required. So, swallowing my exhaustion, I grabbed the cleaning supplies and walked down the darkened hallway toward Richard's sanctuary. His office was a monument to unearned arrogance. It featured dark mahogany furniture, leather-bound books with unbroken spines, and a massive desk that dominated the center of the room. I began my routine wiping down the bookshelves, polishing the glass over his framed college diploma, and moving toward the heavy oak desk. The room smelled of stale liquor and expensive cigars. I knelt on the carpet to dust the baseboards behind his chair. As I shifted my weight, my shoulder bumped hard against the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain down my arm, but more importantly, it dislodged the heavy wooden drawer. It slid open with a metallic scrape, stopping halfway off its tracks. I sighed, rubbing my shoulder, and leaned in to push the drawer back into place. But it would not close. Something was jammed in the very back, wedged between the wooden panel and the metal sliding track. I reached my hand into the dark, narrow gap, my fingers brushing against stiff, heavy paper. It was a thick manila folder, completely unmarked, deliberately, shoved upside down behind the hanging files. My first instinct was simply to pull it out, lay it flat inside the drawer, and finish my chores so I could finally sleep. But as I pulled the folder free, the unsealed flap caught the edge of the metal track and a stack of crisp documents spilled out onto the Persian rug. I knelt there in the dim light of the desk lamp, gathering the papers to put them back. That was when my eyes locked onto the logo printed at the top of the first page. It was the crest of a major national bank, a predatory-ending institution I knew intimately from my professional life. As a senior forensic financial auditor, I spent my days dissecting corporate fraud, untangling hidden assets, and tracking illicit money transfers across the globe. My brain was trained to recognize financial anomalies the way a musician recognizes an out-of-tune instrument. The moment I saw the bold, capitalized words across the top of the document, the obedient, subservient daughter vanished, and the forensic investigator took over. The document was an application and approval form for a home equity line of credit, specifically structured as a reverse mortgage. I stared at the property address listed under the collateral section. It was this house, the beautiful, sprawling, historic colonial home that my grandfather had built with his own hands, the home that he had paid off completely 3 decades ago, leaving it free and clear to Grandma Rose. My heart began to pound against my ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm that echoed in my ears. I shuffled through the pages, my eyes scanning the fine print, the interest rates, the repayment terms. Then I saw the requested loan amount, $150,000. I sat back on my heels, the air suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. Why would Richard and Patricia need $150,000 right now? They had no business ventures. They had no home renovations planned. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The 3-week luxury ski trip to the Swiss Alps, the private chalets in Zermatt, the first-class plane tickets, the vintage wine tastings, and Brittany's upcoming wedding, which Patricia had been bragging would be the social event of the decade, complete with imported orchids and a custom designer gown. They were not paying for these extravagances with their savings. They did not have any savings. They were paying for this lavish, arrogant lifestyle by secretly mortgaging an 82-year-old woman's only shelter. My hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from a rising, suffocating wave of disgust. This was not just greedy. This was monstrous. But the legal reality immediately surfaced in my mind. Grandma Rose was the sole legal owner of the property. Her name was the only one on the deed. Richard and Patricia had absolutely no legal authority to borrow against the equity of a house they did not own. For the bank to process a loan of this magnitude, they would need the explicit notarized consent and signature of the primary title holder. I frantically flipped to the final pages of the contract, the signature authorizations. My eyes darted to the bottom of page 14. There, sitting starkly on the dotted line above the printed name Rose Evans, was a signature in dark blue ink. I stopped breathing. The room seemed to spin, the mahogany walls pressing in on me. I held the paper closer to the lamp, examining the ink strokes with absolute scrutiny. I knew my grandmother's handwriting perfectly. I managed her medical forms, helped her write her holiday cards, and endorsed her small pension checks when her arthritis flared up. Rose's handwriting was small, fragile, and marked by a distinct trembling hesitation in the loops of her letters. The signature on this bank document did not tremble. It was bold, sweeping, and aggressively confident. The capital R featured a sharp, dramatic loop that slashed downward, and the tail of the final S curled upward with an arrogant flourish. I did not just recognize the forgery. I knew exactly who held the pen. I had seen that exact aggressive cursive on thousands of grocery lists, passive-aggressive sticky notes, and high school permission slips. It was Patricia's handwriting. My own mother had forged my grandmother's signature on federal banking documents to commit a massive 6-figure real estate fraud. I sat perfectly still on the floor of the office, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I traced the fraudulent signature with my eyes, letting the sheer magnitude of the crime wash over me. This was not a petty theft. This was a calculated, premeditated felony. I looked at the loan terms again. It was an adjustable rate mortgage with a predatory interest structure. Given Richard's stagnant salary and Patricia's relentless spending addiction, there was absolutely no way they would ever make the monthly interest payments, let alone touch the principal balance. They had no intention of paying it back. They were treating my grandmother's home equity like a winning lottery ticket. When they inevitably defaulted on this massive debt, the bank would not care about their Swiss vacations or Brittany's wedding dress. The bank would execute its right to the collateral. They would foreclose on the property. Grandma Rose, a fragile, trusting woman who spent her days reading by the window and telling stories of a husband she missed dearly, would be served with an eviction notice. She would be thrown out onto the street. Patricia would likely shrug it off, blame the economy, and dump my grandmother into a sterile, underfunded, state-run facility while she and Richard filed for bankruptcy and moved into a rented apartment. They were willing to sacrifice the very life and safety of the woman who gave them a roof over their heads just to impress strangers at a ski resort and throw a party they could not afford. I expected to cry. I expected the familiar crushing weight of inadequacy and betrayal to push tears from my eyes. I expected to feel the broken heart of a daughter whose mother had proven once and for all that she possessed no moral compass. But the tears never came. Instead, a profound icy calm settled over my entire body. The pathetic begging girl who had spent 10 years washing their dishes, absorbing their insults, and making herself small. To keep the peace simply ceased to exist. She burned away in the span of a heartbeat, leaving behind a woman who understood the law, who understood money, and who held the power to destroy them completely. Patricia and Richard thought I was a naive, struggling clerk. They thought I was too stupid to understand what these papers meant, assuming I would never find them, and if I did, I would not know what to do with them. They did not know that sitting on their floor was a highly paid corporate auditor who made a living handing federal evidence over to the authorities. They thought they were playing a clever game of Monopoly, completely unaware that I owned the board. I did not panic. I did not storm upstairs, throw open their bedroom door, and demand an explanation. Screaming would only give them the opportunity to destroy the evidence, gaslight me, and manipulate Grandma Rose before I could protect her. I needed to move in absolute silence. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my phone. I checked the settings, ensuring the flash was off, and the camera was set to the highest resolution. I flattened the first page of the loan application against the carpet, smoothing out every crease. I held my breath to steady my hands and took a picture. I turned the page. I took another picture. I moved methodically, efficiently, photographing every single page of the document. I captured the interest terms, the property appraisal, the routing numbers for the account where the funds were scheduled to be deposited. I took 3 extreme close-up shots of the forged signature, ensuring the sharp, arrogant loop of Patricia's handwriting was captured in undeniable detail. When I finished, I had 42 crystal-clear images of federal financial fraud. I opened my encrypted, dual-authenticated professional email application and attached the images. I drafted a message to my own private offsite server, titling it with the date and the property address. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of impending justice. The moment the screen flashed with the word sent, the trap was officially set. The evidence was preserved in a cloud environment they could never access, never delete, and never deny. I gathered the physical documents, stacked them in perfect alignment, and slid them back into the manila envelope. I wedged the envelope upside down behind the hanging files, exactly how Richard had hidden it. I pushed the bottom drawer back into the tracks until it closed with a soft, metallic click. I stood up, brushed the dust from my knees, and finished wiping down the mahogany desk. I arranged his pens. I turned off the brass desk lamp. I walked out of the office and closed the door quietly behind me. The hallway was dark, silent, and undisturbed. Nothing in the house had physically changed. Richard and Patricia were still asleep upstairs, dreaming of their snowy alpine chalets and their stolen wealth. Brittany was likely dreaming of her diamond rings and floral arrangements. They were sleeping the deep, peaceful sleep of the ignorant. They had no idea that I held the match that was going to burn their entire fraudulent reality to the ground. I walked to my bedroom, my mind buzzing with precise, calculated steps. The pain of their betrayal was gone, replaced by a cold-blooded tactical focus. Tomorrow morning, I would go to the bank. I would go to the lawyer. I would secure my grandmother's future, and I would book a trip to the Maldives. The game had just changed, and I was going to make sure they lost everything. The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds just like any other day, but everything had irrevocably changed. I stood by the counter holding a mug of black coffee, watching my mother and sister flit around the kitchen in a whirlwind of absolute entitlement. Patricia was wearing her cashmere coat, the one she bought using my grandmother credit card supposedly for emergency household expenses. Brittany was beside her scrolling through designer ski resort wear on her phone, holding up different screens for Patricia to approve. They were heading to the most exclusive winter sports boutique downtown to max out whatever available credit they still had left on their personal accounts. They were entirely confident that a $150,000 windfall was just days away from hitting their bank balance. "Make sure you scrub the grout in the guest bathroom, Clara," my mother ordered without even looking in my direction. "And do not forget to pick up mother prescription from the pharmacy. We are going to be out all day looking for the perfect thermal jackets for the Zermatt trip. Todd says the chalets are quite chilly at night, and we simply must look our best for the engagement photos." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground me. I looked at the 2 women who had spent the last decade treating me like a servant in my own family. I saw the pure, unadulterated greed radiating from them. Yesterday, their arrogance would have stung. Today, it just looked pathetic. "Have a wonderful time shopping," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and even. "I will take care of everything here." Patricia gave a dismissive wave of her hand before ushering Brittany out the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, and I listened as Richard SUV backed out of the driveway. The moment the sound of their engine faded down the street, the quiet, subservient daughter they thought they knew vanished completely. In her place stood a senior forensic financial auditor holding the blueprint to their absolute destruction. I walked down the hall to my grandmother's bedroom. Rose was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, reading a paperback novel, with a knitted blanket draped over her lap. She looked so fragile, so incredibly trusting. The thought of my mother throwing this gentle, 82-year-old woman out onto the street to fund a luxury vacation made my chest tight with a cold, calculated fury. "Grandma," I said softly, stepping into the room. "I need you to put your coat on. We are going for a drive downtown. I made an appointment for us, and it is very important." She looked up, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "A drive, my dear. Is everything all right? You usually do your bookkeeping work on Wednesday mornings. Everything is going to be perfectly fine, Grandma. I promised, helping her stand. But we need to take care of some legal paperwork today. Just trust me." She nodded without a single question. That was the tragic beauty of Rose. She trusted her family implicitly. It was the very trait my mother had weaponized against her. I guided her to my dented Toyota parked on the street, carefully buckling her in before taking my place behind the wheel. I did not drive toward the pharmacy or the grocery store. I merged onto the highway and headed straight for the financial district downtown. 30 minutes later, we were stepping into the mahogany-paneled reception area of Sterling & Associates. I had worked with Arthur Sterling on several corporate fraud cases over the years. He was a notoriously harsh estate and real estate attorney. He was not a man who offered warm smiles or gentle reassurances. He was a legal bulldog, a man who dismantled fraudulent contracts with surgical precision. When I had called his private line at 6 a.m. and explained what I had found in Richard's desk, he had immediately cleared his 10 o'clock hour for me. A paralegal escorted us into his corner office. Mr. Sterling sat behind a massive glass desk, his silver hair impeccably combed, his sharp eyes analyzing us as we sat down. He steepled his fingers and looked directly at me. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You mentioned a forged home equity line of credit on your grandmother property. Show me." I unzipped my tote bag and pulled out the thick file folder I had prepared at a 24-hour printing center the night before. I slid the glossy, high-resolution photographs across his desk. I had organized them perfectly. The loan application, the collateral details, the requested amount of $150,000, and the final page featuring the forged signature of Rose Evans. Sterling put on his reading glasses and scrutinized the photos in silence. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room was the only sound. I watched his jaw tighten as he analyzed the interest rate structure and the signature line. After a long minute, he took off his glasses and let out a heavy breath. "This is an aggressive, predatory reverse mortgage," he stated bluntly. "And based on your description of your mother and stepfather financial reality, they have absolutely no means to service this debt. This loan is designed to fail. When it defaults, the bank will seize the collateral. They are essentially selling this house out from under your grandmother." Rose let out a soft, confused gasp next to me. She looked at Mr. Sterling, and then at the photographs on his desk. "Selling the house," she whispered, her hands beginning to tremble in her lap. "But I own the house. Richard said he was just organizing my property tax documents for the year. He said I just needed to verbally authorize him to speak to the county clerk. I never signed any loan." "You did not sign this, Grandma," I said, gently, placing my hand over hers. "Mom did. She forged your name. They are trying to pull equity out of your home to pay for their trip to the Swiss Alps and Brittany wedding." I waited for the shock to overtake her. I braced myself for a medical emergency, for tears of panic or breathless denial. But what happened was far more heartbreaking. Rose did not gasp again. She did not clutch her chest. She simply slumped back into her leather chair as the crushing weight of reality settled over her shoulders. The denial melted away, leaving only a profound, devastating sorrow. A single tear tracked down her wrinkled cheek, catching the light from the office window. She looked at the forged signature on the photograph, her own flesh and blood committing treason in blue ink. "I knew your mother was greedy," she said, her voice breaking into a fragile whisper. "I have always known Patricia loved money more than she loved people, but I never imagined she would dare steal our home. I never thought she would leave me with nothing just to impress her friends." I squeezed her hand tightly, fighting back my own emotional response. "You are not going to be left with nothing, Grandma," I promised fiercely. "That is why we are here. They think they have won, but they do not know what I do for a living, and they do not know Mr. Sterling." Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass desk. The sentimentality vanished, replaced by absolute legal authority. "Here is the situation, Rose," he began, his tone commanding attention. "The loan has been submitted, but it has not been fully processed or funded yet. Banks move slowly on these types of equity lines, especially when verifying property deeds. We are going to build a brick wall right in front of them, and we are going to do it today." How, Rose asked, wiping her cheek with a tissue. "Can we just call the bank and tell them it is fraud?" "We could," Sterling replied, "but that invites a messy police investigation. While the house is still technically vulnerable in your name, Patricia could try to claim you are suffering from dementia and fight you for power of attorney. We are not going to give her the chance to argue. We are going to completely remove the asset from the playing field." He pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from his drawer and aligned them on the desk. "Under my advice, you are going to execute a deed transfer today," he explained. "We are creating an irrevocable living trust. You will transfer the full legal ownership of your home out of your personal name and directly into this trust. Because it is irrevocable, it cannot be altered easily, and it provides an ironclad shield against creditors and fraudulent loan attempts." Rose looked at the paperwork and then at me. "And who controls this trust?" "I recommend naming Clara as the sole beneficiary and the sole administrator of the trust," Sterling stated, looking at me with a nod of professional respect. "Clara is a certified forensic auditor. She knows how to manage assets, and more importantly, she is the only person in your family actively protecting you. If you sign this house over to a trust controlled by Clara, she holds the legal authority over the property." I felt a sudden immense weight settle onto my shoulders. It was one thing to stop a fraudulent loan. It was entirely another to become the sole legal guardian of my grandmother's only remaining asset. I looked at Rose, expecting her to hesitate, to ask for time to think about handing over her life savings to a granddaughter she still thought of as a part-time bookkeeper. Rose did not hesitate for a single second. "Where do I sign?" she asked, her voice suddenly devoid of its previous fragility. Sterling handed her a thick black fountain pen. "Right here at the bottom of page 6 and again on page 9. My paralegal is a licensed notary public and will witness the execution of the document." I watched as my grandmother took the pen. Her hand was steady. There was no trembling hesitation this time. She signed her real name with a deliberate, forceful grace, permanently severing my mother and stepfather's ability to touch her property. The paralegal stepped forward, applying the heavy embosser stamp to the pages. The loud, mechanical crunch of the notary stamp felt like the slamming of a prison door. "It is done," Sterling said, sliding the documents into a secure file. "The deed transfer will be recorded with the county clerk by 3 o'clock this afternoon. The house no longer belongs to Rose Evans. It belongs to the Clara Evans Irrevocable Trust. What happens to the loan Patricia applied for?" I asked, my auditor brain already calculating the timeline. Sterling offered a rare, dark smile. "That is the beauty of this strategy, Clara. When the bank underwriting department goes to pull the final title check before funding the $150,000, they will see that Rose Evans is no longer the owner of the collateral property. The loan will be automatically flagged and rejected." "Will they call Patricia and tell her about the trust?" Rose asked, looking slightly nervous. "No," Sterling replied confidently. "The bank will simply notify the applicants that the collateral verification failed, and the loan has been denied due to a change in title status. Patricia will not know exactly what happened unless she manages to navigate the county public records, which, based on your description of her, she is far too lazy to do. She will just assume the bank made an administrative error." I felt a cold, satisfying thrill wash through my veins. Patricia and Richard were currently wandering through high-end boutiques, swiping their credit cards for luxury snow gear, fully believing they were about to be $150,000 richer. They were building a massive house of cards on a foundation that had just been legally vaporized. "Do not say a single word to them," Sterling advised, looking between me and my grandmother. "Let them continue to dig their own financial grave. Go home, act perfectly normal, and let them pack their bags for Switzerland. When the bank denies the loan, they will be out of the country, completely overextended, and entirely powerless to do anything about it." I shook Sterling's hand, thanking him for his brilliant, swift execution. As I walked Grandma Rose back to my battered Toyota, the air felt lighter. The oppressive, suffocating dread of the past 10 years had been replaced by a fierce, protective armor. When we got into the car, Rose reached over and patted my knee. Her eyes were dry, and a new, quiet strength radiated from her. "You saved my life today, Clara," she said softly. I started the engine and smiled, looking at the woman who had wiped my tears when I was a child. "I am just getting started, Grandma," I replied. We drove back to the sprawling, colonial house, pulling into the driveway just before Patricia and Brittany returned. I went straight to the kitchen, tying an apron around my waist and pulling out the ingredients for dinner. I was going to play my part perfectly. I would chop the vegetables, I would scrub the grout, and I would listen to them brag about their first-class tickets, because I knew a secret that made all their insults utterly meaningless. I was no longer the lowly accountant paying my rent in free labor. I was the sole legal administrator of the very ground they walked on. The legal lockdown was complete, and Patricia, fraudulent mortgage, was dead in the water. Now it was time for me to use my own hidden wealth to plan a real family vacation. It was time to book a $32,000 trip to paradise and let my mother discover the hard way exactly who she had been messing with all these years. Revenge is a strange and complex emotion. When you discover that the people who are supposed to protect you have been actively trying to destroy you, your first instinct is usually explosive. You want to scream. You want to tear through the house, kick open their bedroom door, and demand to know how they could be so ruthlessly cruel. I felt that urge burning in my chest as I drove back from the law office with Grandma Rose. I had the legal documents securing the house safely locked away in my briefcase. I had the ultimate weapon to ruin my mother and stepfather. But as I watched the passing streetlights reflect in my rearview mirror, a much colder, sharper realization settled over my mind. Confronting them now would be too easy. If I exposed the forged mortgage application while they were still in the house, it would undoubtedly start a massive screaming match. Patricia would cry, "Play the victim," and try to twist the narrative to make me look like a hysterical, jealous daughter. Richard would threaten me. Brittany would throw a tantrum about her ruined engagement trip. They would cancel their flights to the Swiss Alps, stay home, and make my life a living nightmare while trying to find a new way to steal my grandmother's assets. I did not want a screaming match. I wanted absolute devastating destruction. I wanted them to feel the exact same sense of helpless humiliation that they had forced me to swallow for the past 10 years. Instead of blowing up the house with the truth immediately, I decided to play a much more sophisticated game. I decided to let them walk willingly into their own trap. They were entirely convinced that their fraudulent $150,000 loan was going to clear while they were out of the country. I was going to let them fly all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, max out their credit cards on luxury ski gear and expensive champagne, and wait for the precise moment their financial house of cards collapsed entirely on its own. But simply watching them fail was not enough. I wanted to give my grandmother the world, and I wanted to use my own hidden success to deliver the ultimate slap in the face to the family that treated me like dirt. That night after the house went completely quiet, and I was sure Patricia and Richard were asleep, I sat at the small desk in my bedroom. I locked my door, opened my personal laptop, and logged into my secure, high-yield investment accounts. For years, I had lived like a ghost, hoarding my salary. From my corporate auditing career, terrified that if I spent a single dime on myself, my mother would find out and demand a cut. My account balances reflected a decade of quiet, relentless hard work. I looked at the numbers glowing on the screen, and for the first time in my life, I gave myself permission to use them. If my mother thought a rented ski chalet in Switzerland was the pinnacle of luxury, I was going to show her what real wealth looked like. I began researching the most exclusive, breathtaking destinations on the planet. I bypassed Europe. I skipped the Caribbean. I wanted somewhere entirely disconnected from reality, a place of pure, unadulterated paradise for a woman who had spent the last decade trapped in her own home. I found exactly what I was looking for in the Indian Ocean: the Maldives. I did not just look for a nice hotel room. I searched for private overwater villas at a 5-star resort, accessible only by seaplane. I found a breathtaking property featuring a massive master suite, a glass floor, to watch the ocean life below a private infinity pool, blending seamlessly into the turquoise water, and a dedicated 24-hour personal butler. It was the kind of place celebrities and billionaires booked to escape the world. But my grandmother was 82 years old, and she had a complex medical regimen. I could not simply fly her to a remote island without ensuring her absolute safety and comfort. Using my professional network, I contacted an elite medical concierge service that specialized in travel care for senior citizens. Within an hour, I had arranged for a private registered traveling nurse to accompany us for the entire 3 weeks. The nurse would handle all of Grandma Rose's daily medications, monitor her vitals, and provide gentle physical therapy sessions right there on the pristine white sand beaches. The total cost for the 2 first-class flights, the private overwater villa for 21 days, the seaplane transfers, the private butler, and the elite medical concierge service came to exactly $32,450. I stared at the checkout screen. A younger, more frightened version of myself would have hesitated. That was a staggering amount of money, more than my stepfather made in half a year. But I did not hesitate. I typed in my routing information, authorized the premium wire transfer, and clicked confirm. The receipt materialized on my screen, bathed in the soft blue light of my monitor. $32,000 paid in full, without touching a single line of credit. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for 10 years. It felt incredible. It felt like I had just purchased my own freedom. The next morning, while Patricia and Brittany were out at a bridal boutique, I sneaked into Grandma Rose's bedroom. I sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out my laptop, showing her the brilliant, sun-drenched photos of the Maldives resort. I explained the private villa, the first-class sleeper seats, and the traveling nurse who would be taking care of her every need. Rose stared at the screen, her delicate hands covering her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not tears of betrayal. "Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "This is too much. You cannot spend this kind of money on me. It is beautiful, but it is entirely too much." I wrapped my arms around her frail shoulders and rested my chin on top of her head. "You gave me a roof over my head when I had nowhere else to go," I told her softly. "You are the only person in this family who ever treated me with kindness. You deserve the absolute best the world has to offer, and I am finally in a position to give it to you. We are going to pack your bags in secret. We are going to hide your luggage in the trunk of my car, and the second they leave for the airport, we are going to paradise." A slow, beautiful smile spread across my grandmother's face. It was a mischievous, sparkling smile I had not seen since I was a little girl. She squeezed my hand tightly, completely on board, with the greatest secret we had ever shared. For the next 2 weeks, the house was a whirlwind of insufferable arrogance. Brittany strutted around the living room in new designer snow boots, loudly complaining about how exhausting it was to pack for multiple formal dinners in the Alps. Richard spent hours on the phone, loudly boasting to his golf buddies about his upcoming European adventure, entirely convinced his fraudulent bank loan was securing his grand lifestyle. I played my role flawlessly. I washed their laundry, ironed their travel clothes, and smiled politely whenever they threw another demeaning comment in my direction. The bitter contrast between their delusion and my reality was almost intoxicating to watch. The climax of their sheer audacity arrived 3 days before their scheduled departure. I was standing in the kitchen, carefully slicing fresh fruit for my grandmother's lunch, when Patricia marched through the swinging door. She was wearing a perfectly tailored wool blazer, her hair freshly styled from the salon. She carried a thick, stapled packet of papers in her right hand, holding it out toward me like a commanding officer issuing battle orders to a foot soldier. "Clara," my mother said, her tone dripping with the kind of condescending authority that used to make my stomach tie itself into knots. "Since you will have the entire house to yourself for 3 weeks, I have put together a comprehensive schedule for you. I expect this place to be spotless when we return." I put down my paring knife and wiped my hands on my apron. I reached out and took the packet. It was 5 pages long, typed, single, spaced, and organized by specific rooms and daily requirements. I scanned the first page, keeping my facial expression completely neutral. It was a masterpiece of exploitation. Patricia had not just listed basic household chores. She had assigned me the kind of grueling, intensive physical labor you would hire a professional crew to handle. "I want the grout in all 4 bathrooms scrubbed with a toothbrush and bleached," Patricia instructed, pointing a manicured finger at the second paragraph. "Richard wants the garage completely reorganized, and all of his golf clubs need to be individually polished. You need to power wash the back patio, clean the gutters, and prune the rose bushes in the front yard. I also left a schedule for Mother's meals. Make sure you do not spend too much on her groceries. The household budget is tight right now." I looked up from the 5-page list. My mother was standing perfectly straight, her chin lifted, waiting for me to nod and accept my punishment. She honestly believed that while she was sipping imported hot chocolate in a Swiss ski lodge, I would be on my hands and knees scrubbing her bathroom floors with a toothbrush. The irony was so sharp, so utterly delicious, that I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. I looked down at the kitchen island. Sitting less than 12 inches from Patricia's manicured hand was my worn, scuffed leather purse. It was the same cheap bag I had carried for 4 years, the one Brittany frequently mocked for being out of style. My mother did not even glance at it. She viewed my belongings as entirely beneath her notice, but inside that cheap, battered purse safely tucked into the hidden zippered compartment was a sleek, embossed travel envelope. Inside that envelope were 2 confirmed fully paid first-class boarding passes to the Maldives. While my mother was eagerly detailing how I should organize her husband's dirty golf clubs, I was literally standing inches away from $32,000 worth of tropical luxury. I looked back down at the chore list, running my thumb over the staple in the corner. "You want me to completely empty the attic and categorize the holiday decorations by color?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly innocent. "Yes," Patricia snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "You have plenty of free time, Clara. It is the least you can do to earn your keep around here while we are away handling important family matters. Do not think you can just sit around and watch television for 3 weeks. I will know if you have been lazy." I took a slow, deep breath. I imagined the pristine white sand, the gentle sound of the Indian Ocean lapping against the stilts of our private water villa, and the look on my mother's face when her fraudulent loan application was completely rejected by the bank. "Of course, Mom," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. I gave her a bright, subservient smile that I knew she expected to see. "I will make sure everything is taken care of exactly the way it deserves to be. You do not need to worry about a single thing here. Just focus on your trip." Patricia gave a curt, satisfied nod, thoroughly convinced she had put me back in my proper place. "See that you do," she muttered, turning on her heel and marching back out of the kitchen to continue packing her designer luggage. I stood alone in the kitchen, the 5-page chore list still clutched in my hand. I slowly turned my head and looked at my scuffed leather purse sitting on the counter. I reached out, resting my hand against the worn material, feeling the firm shape of the travel envelope hidden inside. The trap was fully set. The legal documents transferring the house were secured. The bank loan was destined for a catastrophic failure. The tickets to paradise were printed, and the medical concierge was confirmed. My mother and stepfather were about to board a flight to Europe, completely oblivious to the fact that they were flying straight into financial ruin, while the daughter they treated like a peasant was about to hand her grandmother the world. I tossed the 5-page chore list casually onto the kitchen counter. I picked up my knife, returned to slicing the fresh fruit, and began counting down the hours until their departure. The morning of their departure was a masterclass in unearned arrogance. I stood by the front door holding a tray of freshly brewed coffee, watching my family transform the foyer into a staging ground for their own delusion. 4 massive, brand-new hard-shell suitcases dominated the entryway. The tags were still attached to the handles, swaying slightly every time Richard shoved another bag toward the door. They were metallic silver, the kind of luggage you buy when you want everyone at the airport to know exactly how much money you pretend to have. Richard was sweating profusely, despite the crisp morning air pouring in through the open doorway. He grunted as he heaved the largest suitcase over the threshold. I knew exactly why he was struggling, and it had nothing to do with the physical weight of the bag. It was the financial weight. Over the past week, I had watched them receive a barrage of packages. High-end thermal wear, imported snow boots, designer sunglasses, and custom tailored ski jackets. They had financed every single item on credit, pushing their primary cards to the absolute maximum limit. They were operating on the blind, foolish faith that a $150,000 home equity line of credit was just days away from hitting their checking account. Patricia marched down the stairs wearing a cream-colored cashmere wrap coat that must have cost more than my first car. She paused on the landing, adjusting a pair of oversized designer sunglasses on her face, completely ignoring the fact that we were indoors. "Clara," my mother snapped, pointing a manicured finger toward the kitchen. "I need you to pack a bag of those organic almonds for the flight. Airline food is loaded with sodium, and I simply cannot arrive in Switzerland looking bloated. And make sure you wrap them properly." I nodded, maintaining the blank, subservient expression I had perfected over the last decade. "Right away," I said, turning to head to the kitchen. By the time I returned with her snack, Brittany and Todd had arrived to join the motorcade. Todd was complaining loudly about the traffic on the way over, adjusting the collar of his expensive wool peacoat. Brittany looked like she was walking a runway, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire lavish lifestyle was a house of cards I was about to blow over. She grabbed her iced latte from the tray I held out, not bothering to say thank you. She turned to look at me, her eyes sweeping over my plain jeans and oversized sweater. She offered a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "Have fun staying home," she chirped, linking her arm through Todd's. "Oh, and Clara, remember to clean my bathroom, you lazy bones. I left some empty boxes in there, and the tub needs a serious scrub. I want it smelling like bleach when I get back." Todd let out a short, arrogant chuckle. I kept my hands perfectly still on the edges of the serving tray. "I will make sure the house gets exactly what it deserves," I replied smoothly. Patricia did a final sweep of the living room, grabbing her designer handbag. She paused at the front door, looking back at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Do not forget the list I gave you," she ordered. "I expect the gutters cleaned by Friday, and I want the carpets professionally shampooed. Keep Mother on her schedule. Do not let her sit around watching television all day. Have a safe flight," I said, my voice steady and polite. Richard slammed the trunk of the oversized SUV shut. He climbed into the driver's seat, letting out a loud sigh of relief. Patricia slid into the passenger side, pulling the vanity mirror down to check her lipstick one last time. Brittany and Todd climbed into the back, already taking selfies to document the beginning of their luxurious European adventure. I stood on the front porch and watched the heavy SUV back out of the driveway. The tires crunched against the gravel, the exhaust billowing in the cool morning air. I watched the bright red taillights turn at the end of the street, flashing once before disappearing entirely from view. The moment they were gone, the entire atmosphere of the property shifted. The suffocating heavy tension that had occupied the house for 10 years seemed to instantly evaporate. The air felt lighter. I stood on the porch for a long time, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning wind, feeling the absolute certainty of what was about to happen. I turned around and walked back inside, closing the heavy oak door and locking the deadbolt. I walked straight into the kitchen, ignoring the dirty coffee cups they had left scattered across the countertops. I picked up the 5-page single-spaced list of grueling household chores Patricia had handed me the day before. I held the crisp white paper in my hands, feeling the physical weight of her entitlement. I did not just throw it away. I gripped the edges of the thick paper and ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper echoed beautifully in the quiet kitchen. I tore it again and again until the arrogant demands of my mother were reduced to tiny, meaningless shreds of confetti. I dropped the pieces directly into the trash bin, watching them land on top of wet coffee grounds and discarded eggshells. It was the exact place her authority over me belonged. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked down the hallway toward my grandmother's bedroom. I knocked softly and pushed the door open. Rose was not sitting in her armchair. She was standing by the edge of her bed, dressed in a beautiful, flowing navy blue linen pantsuit that I had bought for her in secret 3 days ago. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, and she wore a delicate string of pearls around her neck. Sitting on the bed next to her were 2 sleek, high-quality travel suitcases, packed and ready. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were afraid Patricia might suddenly materialize from the shadows. "They are gone, Grandma." I smiled, walking over to pick up her bags. "They are on their way to the airport. The house is ours." Rose let out a long, shuddering breath, pressing her hand against her chest. I saw a spark of genuine excitement dance in her eyes, replacing the weary sadness that had clouded them for years. She looked down at her new clothes, smoothing the fabric with trembling fingers. "I have not worn something this beautiful in a very long time," she said softly. "I feel like I am dreaming, Clara. Are you sure we are really doing this?" "We are really doing this," I promised, linking my arm gently through hers. "We are leaving the exact same way they did, only we actually paid for our trip." I guided her out of the bedroom and down the long hallway. As we reached the foyer, the low, steady purr of a heavy engine drifted through the front windows. I opened the door, and Rose let out a soft gasp of sheer delight. Pulling into the driveway precisely on schedule was an immaculate jet-black luxury limousine. The sunlight gleamed off the polished exterior, the tinted windows offering complete privacy. The driver, a tall man in a tailored dark suit and a crisp white shirt, immediately stepped out of the vehicle. He walked around to the passenger side, opening the heavy rear door with practiced professional grace. He did not honk the horn impatiently like Richard always did. He walked directly up the porch steps, offering a warm, respectful smile. "Good morning, Ms. Evans," the driver said, addressing my grandmother directly. "My name is David. I will be taking you to your private terminal today. Let me get those bags for you." Rose looked at me, her eyes wide with astonishment. "A private terminal?" she whispered. "Only the best for you," I replied, helping her down the steps. David gently took the suitcases from my hands and secured them in the spacious trunk. He returned to offer his arm to my grandmother, escorting her down the driveway as if she were visiting royalty. I watched her step into the plush, spacious interior of the limousine, sinking into the soft leather seats. For 10 years, Patricia had treated this woman like an inconvenient piece of furniture. Today, she was being treated with the absolute dignity and respect she deserved. I locked the front door of the house one final time, feeling a profound sense of closure. The property was legally locked inside an irrevocable trust, completely untouchable. The house was safe. My grandmother was safe. And I was finally free. I climbed into the back of the limousine, sliding into the luxurious leather seat next to Rose. The doors closed, sealing us inside a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary. David started the engine, and the heavy vehicle glided effortlessly down the driveway, pulling away from the house that had been my prison for so long. Rose reached across at the wide center console and took my hand. Her skin was warm, her grip surprisingly strong. She did not say a word, but the tears glistening in her eyes spoke volumes. I squeezed her hand back, leaning my head against the tinted glass as we merged onto the highway toward the airport. Our flight to the Maldives was scheduled for the late afternoon, giving us plenty of time to relax in the exclusive first-class lounge. I had arranged for our private medical concierge, a highly trained registered nurse named Sarah, to meet us directly at the gate. Everything was perfectly orchestrated, meticulously planned down to the smallest detail. But my most important piece of planning had nothing to do with our tropical destination. It had everything to do with the digital trap I had set back in the United States. When I discovered the forged loan documents, I had immediately contacted the major credit bureaus and the specific bank handling the fraudulent application. With the guidance of Lawyer Sterling, I had placed a maximum security fraud alert and a hard title lock on my grandmother's identity. I also linked my own professional contact information to the fraud alert system, ensuring that any attempt to draw funds against the suspended collateral would trigger an immediate real-time notification directly to my phone. Switzerland is 6 hours ahead of our time zone on the East Coast. Patricia, Richard, Todd, and Brittany had taken an early morning flight out of Boston. By the time my grandmother and I were settling into the plush leather armchairs of the private airport lounge, sipping sparkling water and waiting for our nurse to arrive, my family was landing at Zurich Airport. I knew exactly what their itinerary looked like. Patricia had bragged about it endlessly. They were scheduled to land clear customs and immediately head to the international banking desk at the airport. Richard needed to secure a massive cash advance in Swiss francs to pay the initial luxury deposit on their Zermatt ski chalet, a deposit he fully intended to pull directly from the fraudulent home equity line of credit. I pulled my phone from my purse and set it on the polished glass table in front of me. The screen was dark, silent, waiting. I looked at the digital clock on the wall of the lounge. It was early afternoon here, which meant it was prime evening hours in Zurich. They were off the plane. They were likely dragging those 4 massive unpaid suitcases across the polished floors of the Swiss terminal. I imagined Richard walking confidently up to the banking teller, handing over his passport and his account information, completely certain that a bottomless well of stolen cash was waiting for him. My phone vibrated violently against the glass table. The screen illuminated, flashing with a bright red priority notification banner. It was an automated alert from the National Bank's high-security fraud department. I picked up the device, unlocking the screen with a calm, measured swipe of my thumb. The notification text was precise, clinical, and utterly devastating. Alert. International transaction attempted. Account ending in 4822. Location flagged. Zurich Airport. Currency exchange. Attempted withdrawal amount $25,000 US. I watched the screen, my heart beating a slow, triumphant rhythm. 3 seconds later, a second notification popped up, layering perfectly over the first. Status: transaction denied. Account frozen. Reason: collateral title invalid. Fraud alert active. Please contact the legal underwriting department immediately. I sat back in my plush armchair, a cold, satisfied smile spreading slowly across my face. It was happening. Thousands of miles away, on a different continent, the financial guillotine had just dropped. I could visualize the exact sequence of events unfolding at that banking desk. I pictured the Swiss teller looking at the computer screen, frowning slightly, and politely informing Richard that the transaction could not be completed. I imagined Richard's arrogant smile, faltering his face, flushing red as he demanded they run the card again. I pictured Patricia standing behind him in her expensive cashmere coat, tapping her foot impatiently, totally unaware that the ground had just vanished beneath her designer shoes. My phone buzzed a third time, then a fourth. Alert. Attempted transaction denied. Location flagged Zurich Airport, ATM. Attempted withdrawal amount $5,000. Status denied. Account locked. They were panicking. The automated system was rejecting every desperate attempt they made to pull cash from an account that essentially no longer existed. The bank's underwriting software had run the final verification check, discovered the property deed had been legally transferred to my irrevocable trust, and instantly voided the entire loan application. They were standing in one of the most expensive countries in the world, with maxed-out credit cards, no cash, and a luxury ski chalet demanding a deposit they could not pay. I locked my phone screen and slipped the device back into my purse. I looked over at Grandma Rose. She was happily reading a travel magazine, her face glowing with the anticipation of walking on a white sand beach. She had no idea that a brutal, uncompromising justice was currently raining down on the people who had tried to destroy her. The drama was escalating faster than I had even predicted. My mother was about to realize that the lowly accountant she had treated like a servant had just masterminded the absolute ruin of her entire fraudulent empire. And as our boarding call for the Maldives echoed softly through the private lounge, I knew the real warfare was only just beginning. The transition from the sterile environment of an international airport to the vibrant, breathtaking expanse of the Indian Ocean felt like stepping into an entirely different universe. Our private seaplane descended from the cloudless azure sky, skimming over waters so impossibly clear and blue they looked like liquid sapphire. I watched my grandmother press her face against the small oval window of the cabin. For the first time in a decade, the heavy lines of worry and exhaustion that had etched themselves into her face seemed to completely vanish. She looked like a young woman again, captivated by the sheer beauty of a world she thought she would never get to see. When the seaplane gently docked at the private wooden pier of our luxury resort, a team of welcoming staff was already waiting for us. The warm, tropical breeze immediately enveloped us, carrying the sweet scent of exotic flowers and salt air. A personal butler named Julian stepped forward with a warm, genuine smile, handing us chilled, scented towels and glasses of fresh, tropical fruit juice. There was no rushing, no impatient sighs, and absolutely no chore lists. There was only absolute, uncompromising peace. Julian guided us along a winding wooden boardwalk that stretched far out over the pristine coral reef toward our overwater villa. When he unlocked the massive carved wooden door and swung it open, Grandma Rose actually gasped out loud and covered her mouth with both hands. The villa was a masterpiece of tropical architecture. It featured soaring vaulted ceilings, a massive plush king-sized bed, draped in sheer white canopy curtains, and a sprawling living area with a glass bottom floor that revealed colorful tropical fish swimming lazily through the crystal clear water directly beneath our feet. Beyond the sliding glass walls lay a massive private deck complete with a sunken infinity pool that seemed to spill right out into the endless ocean horizon. We were perfectly accommodated. Sarah, the elite, traveling registered nurse, I had hired seamlessly, unpacked Rose medication and set up a discreet, comfortable care station in the secondary suite. She took my grandmother blood pressure, checked her vitals, and smiled warmly, assuring me that the long flight had not taken any toll on her fragile health. For the first time in years, I did not have to set an alarm to dispense pills or prepare specialized meals. I did not have to scrub grout or listen to my mother degrading remarks. I simply stood on the sun-drenched deck breathing in the warm ocean air, while my grandmother wept tears of pure, absolute joy. That evening, the resort staff arranged a private dining experience for us right on our overwater deck. The sky transformed into a breathtaking canvas of deep violet, burning orange, and vibrant pink as the sun slowly dipped below the ocean horizon. Lanterns flickered softly around the perimeter of the deck, casting a warm, golden glow over a beautifully set table lined with crisp white linen and shining silver cutlery. Julian, our butler, served us a magnificent feast. We started with delicate seared scallops and a vibrant citrus salad, followed by the main course of freshly caught local lobster tails, grilled to absolute perfection and drenched in a rich garlic butter sauce. I watched Grandma Rose take her first bite of the lobster. She closed her eyes and let out a soft sound of pure contentment. She had spent the last decade surviving on whatever meager leftovers Patricia allowed her to have confined to a dusty armchair in a house that was technically hers. Tonight, she was dining on a private island, being treated with the utmost reverence and dignity. "You know, Clara?" She said, her voice soft but steady as she looked out over the darkened water. "I always dreamed of seeing places like this when your grandfather was alive. We used to look at travel brochures in the evening and imagine what the sand felt like. I thought those dreams died with him. I never imagined I would actually be sitting here feeling the ocean breeze on my face." I reached across the white linen tablecloth and gently covered her hand with mine. "You deserve this, Grandma." I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "You deserve every ounce of beauty in this world. You spent your whole life taking care of others, and now it is my turn to take care of you." We raised our crystal glasses of sparkling water, toasting to freedom, to fresh starts, and to the profound relief of finally escaping the toxic grip of my mother and stepfather. The contrast between this moment of absolute serenity and the 5-page list of grueling physical chores currently sitting in the kitchen trash can back in Boston was almost dizzying. Patricia genuinely believed I was currently on my hands and knees, scrubbing her bathtubs. She believed I was trapped alone, serving my sentence as the unappreciated scapegoat of the family. The sheer scale of her delusion only made the lobster taste that much sweeter. The following morning, the Maldivian sun rose in a brilliant blaze of gold, and the true execution of my plan began. I woke up early, feeling completely rested for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. I slipped into a new swimsuit I had purchased just for this occasion, and walked out onto the private deck. The infinity pool was cool and inviting, the water reflecting the endless blue sky above. Sarah had already helped Grandma Rose get dressed for the day. My grandmother emerged onto the deck wearing a stylish, wide-brimmed sun hat and oversized sunglasses, looking every bit the wealthy, relaxed matriarch she was always meant to be. I ordered a lavish, floating breakfast from the resort kitchen. Within 30 minutes, Julian arrived with a massive woven tray loaded with fresh tropical fruits, warm pastries, artisan cheeses, and a silver bucket holding a bottle of chilled vintage champagne. He carefully placed the tray into the pristine water of our infinity pool. I helped Grandma Rose sit on the submerged steps of the pool, the warm water lapping gently at her waist. I waded into the pool beside her, picking up 2 crystal champagne flutes. I handed one to my grandmother and held my own up toward the sunlight. "Grandma," I said, pulling my phone from the dry edge of the pool deck, "we need to take a picture to remember this exact moment." She smiled brilliantly, raising her glass high. I positioned the camera to capture the absolute perfection of our reality. The frame included the sparkling crystal glasses, the decadent floating breakfast tray, the stunning turquoise water of the private pool, and the endless, breathtaking expanse of the Indian Ocean behind us. But the most beautiful part of the image was my grandmother's face glowing with genuine happiness, completely free from the suffocating anxiety of her previous life. I snapped the photo. It was flawless. I climbed out of the pool, dried my hands on a plush towel, and sat down on a lounge chair to compose the final nail in the coffin. I opened my social media accounts. For years, my profiles had been completely silent. I never posted about my promotions, my financial success, or my personal achievements because I knew Patricia would twist them to serve her own greedy narrative. But today, I was breaking that silence with the force of a wrecking ball. I uploaded the pristine picture of our champagne toast in the infinity pool. I made sure the location tag was prominently displayed, marking us exactly at the ultra-exclusive 5-star Maldivian resort. Then I carefully typed out a single calculated sentence for the caption. Taking care of Grandma in the truest sense of the word. I love you. I did not mention Patricia. I did not mention Richard or Brittany or their fraudulent ski trip. I let the image and the location do all the talking. I hit publish, sharing the post simultaneously to Facebook and Instagram. I set the phone face down on the wooden side table, picked up a fresh croissant from the breakfast tray, and simply waited for the explosion. It did not take long. The digital shockwave rippled across the world faster than I could have anticipated. Within 10 minutes, my screen began lighting up with notifications. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends from our church community in Boston began liking and commenting in a frenzy of absolute confusion and awe. People who had been told by my mother that I was just a struggling broke clerk were suddenly looking at me vacationing like a billionaire. The comments poured in asking if I had won the lottery, asking how beautiful the weather was, praising me for treating my elderly grandmother to such a spectacular holiday. And then, exactly 47 minutes after I clicked publish, the ultimate notification flashed across my screen. The caller ID displayed the name Patricia. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the chaotic, desperate energy I knew was vibrating on the other end of the line. I took a slow sip of my chilled champagne, letting the crisp bubbles wash over my tongue. On the 4th ring, I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not even have the chance to say hello before the sheer absolute panic of my mother voice shattered the digital connection. "Where are you?" Patricia shrieked, her voice entirely devoid of its usual arrogant polish. It sounded like she was standing in a massive echoing cavern, likely the international terminal of the Zurich airport. "Clara, what is that picture? Where did you take that picture?" I reclined into my cushioned lounge chair, looking out at the calm, gentle waves. "Good morning, Mom," I said, my tone perfectly pleasant and completely unbothered. "Or I suppose it is evening for you. How was the flight to Switzerland?" "Stop playing games with me, Clara!" she screamed, the hysteria in her throat, climbing higher with every syllable. "Brittany just showed me your post. You are supposed to be at the house scrubbing the guest bathroom. How are you in the Maldives? How did you afford a resort that costs thousands of dollars a night? You do not make that kind of money." I smiled, letting the warm, tropical sun bake into my skin. "I make exactly enough to take care of my family the way they deserve to be taken care of," I replied calmly. There was a frantic, chaotic shuffling sound on the other end of the line. I could hear Richard yelling something in the background, his voice thick with raw, absolute terror. I could hear the distinct automated announcements of the Swiss airport echoing through the phone. "Clara, you need to tell me what is going on right now." Patricia gasped, her breathing turning rapid and shallow. "We just went to the currency exchange desk to pull the cash for the chalet deposit. My bank account is frozen. The teller said the transaction was denied due to a title invalidation. The credit cards are declining. We are stuck in the airport terminal with 4 suitcases, and the chalet manager is demanding payment. What did you do? What have you done to the house?" I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, allowing her to fully absorb the catastrophic reality of her situation. She was stranded thousands of miles from home, standing in an expensive foreign country, with no cash, no access to credit, and a massive impending bill she could never hope to pay. The fraudulent $150,000 loan had collapsed exactly as lawyer Sterling had promised, severing her financial lifeline the moment the bank detected the legal transfer of the deed. She thought she had outsmarted everyone. She thought she could forge her own mother's signature, steal an elderly woman home equity, and fund a luxurious European fantasy while leaving me behind to clean her toilets. She was finally realizing that she had brought a knife to a gunfight against a corporate forensic auditor. "Clara, answer me." Patricia sobbed, the arrogant matriarch completely broken down into a panicked, terrified shell of a woman. "Please, you have to call the bank. You have to fix this. We have nothing. What did you do?" I looked over at Grandma Rose, who was happily pointing out a colorful school of fish swimming past the wooden stilts of our deck. She looked safe, completely protected from the toxic venom of the woman screaming through my phone speaker. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I delivered the final, devastating blow with the cool, clinical precision of an executioner. "I am just fulfilling my family duties exactly as you instructed, Mom," I said softly. Before she could utter another frantic word, I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button. The call disconnected, terminating the link between my tropical paradise and her freezing European nightmare. I opened my phone settings and immediately blocked her number. I blocked Richard. I blocked Brittany. I severed all digital ties, silencing the chaotic, desperate fallout of their financial collapse. I placed the phone back down onto the table face down. I picked up my crystal champagne flute and walked back over to the edge of the infinity pool. I slipped back into the warm water, joining my grandmother as the Maldivian sun sparkled brilliantly across the surface of the ocean. The trap had not just closed, it had utterly annihilated them. And for the first time in 32 years, I was exactly where I was meant to be, completely untouchable and entirely free. For a decade, I had allowed myself to be ground down into nothing. I had convinced myself that absorbing their abuse was the only way to shield the one person I loved from their cruelty. I had sat at the dining room table eating scraps while they dined on my grandmother's generosity. I had listened to them boast about their upcoming trips, their new cars, and their expensive clothes, while my bank account quietly grew through grueling, unseen labor. They thought my silence was weakness. They mistook my patience for stupidity. They never understood that when you push a competent, intelligent woman into the shadows, she does not just disappear, she learns how to operate in the dark. The water in the pool felt like warm silk against my skin. I took a deep breath of the salt-tinged air, letting the reality of my absolute victory wash over me. The Swiss Alps were currently freezing over a family that had built their entire identity on a mountain of lies. Patricia would have to explain to Todd, the arrogant future son-in-law, that the wealthy, sophisticated family he thought he was marrying into was entirely bankrupt. Brittany would watch her luxurious wedding plans dissolve into thin air right alongside her mother-forged credit line. Richard would have to face the humiliation of begging an airport hotel for a cheap room while trying to scrounge together enough money for economy tickets back to a house he no longer had any right to enter. They were experiencing the exact terror and isolation they had tried to force upon my grandmother. It was not just revenge, it was a perfect symmetrical justice. I raised my glass, gently clinking it against Rose's flute. The clear, sharp sound of the crystal ringing out over the quiet ocean was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The future was unwritten, but for the first time it belonged entirely to us. The chains of the past were broken, completely shattered by the weight of their own greed. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the edge of the pool, and let the bright tropical sun warm my face completely at peace in the paradise we had earned. The gentle rhythm of the Indian Ocean lapping against the wooden stilts of our private villa was the only sound breaking the perfect morning silence. I sat on a plush white lounge chair under the shade of a thatched umbrella, sipping a glass of fresh mango juice. A few feet away, my grandmother Rose was walking slowly along the shallow edge of our infinity pool, letting the warm turquoise water wash over her ankles. She looked so entirely at peace, so completely untethered from the heavy, suffocating anxiety that had ruled her life back in Boston. I smiled, watching her. But my mind was already crossing the Atlantic Ocean, calculating the exact level of devastation currently unfolding in the freezing altitudes of the Swiss Alps. When you block someone on your phone, their calls do not simply vanish into thin air. They are routed directly into a hidden voicemail folder securely stored away from your immediate attention, but preserved for the record. For the first 2 days of our trip, I had ignored that folder completely. I wanted to give myself and my grandmother 48 hours of absolute, untainted paradise. But as the third morning dawned bright and clear over the Maldives, I knew the financial time bomb I had planted back home had officially detonated. It was time to survey the wreckage. I set my juice glass down on the wooden side table and pulled my phone from my beach bag. I unlocked the screen, navigating to the blocked messages folder. There were 14 new voicemails and 32 blocked text messages. The timeline of the audio recordings told a perfect sequential story of arrogance, confusion, panic, and ultimate destruction. I put a single wireless earbud into my right ear, leaving the left one open, so I could still hear the soothing sound of the ocean waves. I pressed play on the very first message recorded roughly 24 hours earlier, just as my family would have been arriving at their luxury ski resort. The first voice belonged to my stepfather, Richard. He did not sound angry yet. He sounded deeply annoyed, incredibly inconvenienced and dripping with his usual unearned authority. "Clara, pick up the phone," Richard barked, his voice echoing slightly as if he were standing in a large, cavernous space. "We are standing at the reception desk of the Zermatt Chalet, and there is some sort of ridiculous issue with my primary credit card. The concierge is refusing to release the keys to our suite until the remaining balance for the month is authorized. I called the bank, and the automated system says the home equity line of credit has not been funded. You need to call the local branch manager in Boston right now and tell them to push the wire transfer through immediately. Patricia is freezing, and Todd is getting impatient. Fix this, Clara. Do your job." The message ended with a sharp click. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes and picturing the scene perfectly. I could see the grand wood-paneled lobby of the five-star Swiss resort with its roaring stone fireplaces and massive glass windows overlooking the snow-covered peaks. I could see Richard standing at the polished mahogany reception desk, his face flushing red with embarrassment as a polite but firm Swiss hotel manager slid his declined platinum card back across the marble counter. They had flown across the world entirely dependent on stolen money they assumed was already sitting in their account. I tapped the screen and played the next voicemail recorded 2 hours later. The tone had completely shifted. The arrogant annoyance had vanished, replaced by a rising, frantic desperation. "Clara." "Where are you?" Patricia's voice shrilled through the tiny speaker. Her breathing was fast and shallow, the sound of a woman standing on the edge of a very steep cliff. Richard just spent an hour on the phone with the International Underwriting Department. They told him the collateral verification failed. They said the house is no longer in mother name. They said the deed was transferred to a trust. "What does that mean, Clara?" "What did you do?" "The bank canceled the entire loan. We have absolutely no money. My credit cards are maxed out from the ski gear and the flights. The hotel is threatening to call the local authorities if we do not leave the lobby. Answer your phone right now." I opened my eyes and watched a small white bird dive toward the sparkling ocean surface. Patricia had finally hit the brick wall I had built for her. The illusion of her wealth, the grand facade she had constructed to impress Brittany's wealthy fiancé, had just shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces in the middle of a foreign country. She could no longer hide behind my unpaid labor or my grandmother's stolen assets. She was entirely exposed. The voicemails continued, charting their rapid descent into total chaos. There was a message filled with Richard shouting profanities, threatening to sue the bank, threatening to sue me, demanding I reverse whatever clerical error I had maliciously caused. But the most revealing message, the one that truly captured the absolute collapse of their social empire, came from my sister Brittany. I pressed play on this 8th audio file. Brittany was not yelling. She was sobbing so violently that she could barely form coherent sentences. The background noise had changed from the echoing lobby of a luxury resort to the muffled, cold sounds of a busy transit station. "Clara, you ruined my life," Brittany wailed, her voice cracking with pure devastation. "Todd left me. He actually left me here at the train station." I sat up straight, adjusting the earbud to catch every single word. He was standing right next to Dad at the hotel desk when the manager told us we had to leave. Brittany continued between heavy, gasping sobs. Todd heard everything. He heard Dad arguing with the bank on speakerphone. He heard them say the loan was rejected because of a title transfer. Todd demanded to know what loan Dad was talking about. Mom tried to lie to him. She tried to tell him it was just a minor business cash flow problem. But Todd is not stupid, Clara. He works in corporate logistics. He looked right at Dad and asked if this entire trip was being funded by a second mortgage on a house they did not even own. I could visualize the absolute humiliation of that exact moment. Todd, the arrogant junior executive who cared about nothing more than social status and financial security, suddenly realizing he was about to marry into a family of broke, desperate frauds. "Dad could not even look Todd in the eye," Brittany cried, her voice dropping into a hoarse whisper. "Todd told me my family was a complete embarrassment. He said he could not legally bind himself to a family that commits financial crimes to pay for a vacation. He took his platinum card out of his wallet, paid the hotel manager for his own private transport back to the Zurich airport, and walked out the front door. He told me the wedding is cancelled. He told me not to contact him again. We are sitting on our luggage at a public train station, Clara. We do not even have enough money to buy food. Mom is having a complete breakdown. How could you do this to us? You are a monster." The voicemail ended, leaving a profound ringing silence in my ear. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. They were perfectly steady. I felt no pity for my sister. Brittany had happily worn designer clothes bought with money intended for our grandmother medical care. She had smiled in my face while secretly plotting to steal the very roof over my head. Todd leaving her was not a tragedy. It was simply the inevitable consequence of building a relationship on a foundation of greedy lies. The truth always demands to be paid eventually, and Brittany Bill had just come due in the middle of the Swiss Alps. I switched over to the blocked text messages, scrolling past dozens of frantic demands from Richard and tearful guilt trips from Brittany. At the very bottom of the screen were the latest messages sent by my mother just a few hours ago. Patricia had moved past panic and entered a state of vicious, cornered aggression. The words on the screen practically dripped with her toxic entitlement. "I am giving you one chance to fix this." Clara, the first text read, "You will call the bank immediately. You will tell them you made a mistake with the paperwork, and you will unlock Mother House right now." I scrolled down to the next message. "If you do not wire $10,000 to my account by the end of the day to get us out of this train station, I swear to God I will destroy you. You are a miserable, jealous little girl who could not stand to see her sister happy." And then the final message, the ultimate desperate threat of a woman who had entirely run out of options. "I am calling the American authorities." Patricia had typed the letters in all capitals. "I am calling Adult Protective Services and the police. I am telling them you kidnapped an 82-year-old woman and forced her to sign her house over to you. I will have you arrested for elder abuse and fraud. You will rot in a prison cell, Clara. Call me back right now or I make the call." I read the threat 3 times, letting the sheer audacity of her words sink in. The woman who had forged my grandmother's signature to steal $150,000 was now threatening to have me arrested for fraud. It was a spectacular display of psychological projection. Patricia genuinely believed that because she was willing to commit a crime, everyone else must be doing the same thing. She thought her threat would terrify me into submission. She thought I would scramble to call her back, begging for forgiveness, terrified of the police showing up at my door. I let out a soft, quiet laugh. It bubbled up from my chest, carrying away the last lingering remnants of the scared, subservient daughter I used to be. I looked up from my screen toward the edge of the water. Grandma Rose had found a large, beautifully intact conch shell half buried in the wet sand. She picked it up, carefully rinsing it in the crystal-clear water of the Indian Ocean, before turning around to show it to me. Her smile was brighter than the tropical sun overhead. "Look at this, Clara," she called out, her voice carrying over the gentle ocean breeze. "I have never seen a shell with such beautiful pink colors inside. Do you think we can bring it home with us?" I smiled back at her, sliding my phone into my beach bag. "We can bring home absolutely anything you want, Grandma," I promised. I leaned back into the plush cushions of my lounge chair, interlacing my fingers behind my head. Patricia's threat to involve the police did not scare me in the slightest. In fact, it was exactly what I had been waiting for. I had spent my entire professional career documenting financial crimes, preparing ironclad dossiers for federal investigators, and ensuring that every single legal loophole was tightly closed before moving in for the kill. Patricia thought she was initiating a criminal investigation against me. She did not realize she was actually handing the authorities the rope to hang her with. I had already anticipated this exact move. Before we had even left the country, I had coordinated a comprehensive legal strategy with Attorney Sterling. The 42 high-resolution photographs of Patricia's forged signature were safely locked in a secure legal server. The medical records proving my grandmother's absolute mental competency were signed by her primary care physician and notarized, and I had a verified recorded video of Rose sitting in Sterling office completely lucid, explicitly stating her desire to transfer her property to protect it from her daughter's financial abuse. If Patricia wanted to bring the police into this family dispute, I was more than ready to welcome them. I had the evidence, the legal authority, and the absolute moral high ground. Let her call the police, I thought, staring out at the endless, pristine horizon. Let her dig the hole even deeper. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of my grandmother happily humming a quiet tune as she waded through the shallow turquoise water. The storm was currently raging thousands of miles away, in a freezing European train station. But here, on this private island, there was nothing but sunshine and perfect, unbothered peace. The financial house of cards had completely collapsed, and the people who had tried to bury me were now suffocating under the rubble of their own greed. The next phase of the war would be fought in the legal arena, but for today I was officially off the clock. I signaled to our private butler standing discreetly near the villa entrance and asked for a refill of fresh mango juice. My family was currently learning the hardest lesson of their lives, and I was going to enjoy every single second of my vacation before returning home to finish the job. The ocean breeze felt entirely different on the fourth morning of our trip. It was no longer just carrying the sweet scent of saltwater and jasmine. It carried the distinct electric charge of an impending storm. This was not a literal storm gathering over the Indian Ocean. It was the legal hurricane I had been patiently waiting for. I was sitting at the glass dining table in our overwater villa reviewing some remote audit files on my laptop when my phone vibrated against the polished wood. The caller ID did not show my mother's frantic overseas number. It displayed the crisp professional contact card for Attorney Sterling back in Boston. I picked up the phone and swiped the screen to answer. I did not say a word at first, simply listening to the background noise on the other end. I could hear the faint crackle of a police radio and the heavy, authoritative murmur of official conversations. "Good morning, Clara," Mr. Sterling said. His voice was remarkably calm, but there was a sharp, undeniable edge of amusement cutting through his usual gravelly tone. "I hope the weather in the Maldives is as beautiful as you anticipated." "The weather is absolute perfection," I replied, leaning back in my chair and looking out at the endless blue horizon. I assume by the sound of those sirens that the weather in Boston is slightly more turbulent. You could say that he chuckled softly. "Your mother actually did it. She made good on her threat." Patricia called the local precinct from Switzerland and filed a formal report. She also contacted the National Hotline for Adult Protective Services. According to the completely hysterical narrative she fed to the dispatchers, "You are a financially unstable rogue bookkeeper who kidnapped an elderly woman suffering from severe dementia." I let out a slow, steady breath. The sheer audacity of her lie was staggering. Patricia had essentially accused me of executing the exact crime she had been attempting to commit. It is a classic psychological defense mechanism known as projection. When toxic people are backed into a corner, they will accuse you of the very sins they are actively committing. She wanted to frame me as a desperate thief to deflect attention from her own massive federal fraud. "What exactly did she tell them?" I asked, taking a sip of my coffee. Sterling rustled some papers on his end of the line. "She claimed that you abducted Rose in the middle of the night, forced her onto an international flight, and manipulated her into signing her property over to you." Patricia painted herself as the devoted, terrified daughter, stranded in a foreign country, absolutely sick with worry over her vulnerable mother. The police took it very seriously. I currently have 2 detectives and a senior social worker standing in your grandmother's living room looking for a crime scene. I could perfectly picture the chaos unfolding in that house. I imagined the detectives walking through the immaculate rooms searching for signs of a struggle. I imagined the social worker holding a clipboard preparing to initiate a nationwide manhunt for a missing senior citizen. "It is time to drop the curtain," I told Sterling, my voice hardening into pure professional resolve. "You have the green light to release the entire dossier." I hung up the phone and walked out onto the sun-drenched deck of our villa. Grandma Rose was sitting in a plush lounge chair wearing a beautiful floral sundress, holding a cup of herbal tea. She looked up at me, her eyes bright and completely clear. "Was that the lawyer?" she asked, setting her teacup down on the small wicker table. "Yes, Grandma," I said, kneeling down beside her chair so we were at eye level. "Patricia called the authorities. She told them I kidnapped you and stole your house because you are too sick to understand what is going on." Rose did not flinch. A few weeks ago, an accusation like that would have sent her into a spiral of anxiety and shame. But the woman sitting in front of me had shed her fear somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. She sat up perfectly straight, her shoulders squared, and a fierce, protective fire ignited in her eyes. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice steady and resolute. I pulled my phone from my pocket and switched the camera to video mode. "We need to show them exactly how sick and manipulated you are," I smiled. I positioned the camera to capture the breathtaking background of the turquoise ocean and the luxurious infinity pool. I made sure the lighting caught the healthy, radiant glow on my grandmother's face. I pressed record and gave her a gentle nod. "My name is Rose Evans." My grandmother spoke directly into the lens, her voice carrying the undeniable authority of a matriarch who had finally reclaimed her power. "I am 82 years old, and I am in full and complete possession of my mental faculties. I am currently enjoying a spectacular luxury vacation in the Maldives, entirely paid for by my brilliant granddaughter Clara. I am here completely of my own free will." She paused, taking a breath to steady her emotions before delivering the absolute truth. "I recently discovered that my daughter Patricia and my son-in-law Richard attempted to forge my signature on a massive home equity loan. They intended to steal the equity from my fully paid home to finance their own luxury vacations and social events, leaving me to face foreclosure. To protect myself, I voluntarily sought independent legal counsel. I willingly transferred the deed of my home into an irrevocable trust managed by Clara. She did not manipulate me. She saved me from becoming a victim of elder financial abuse at the hands of my own child." She smiled warmly at the camera, completely unbothered and utterly composed. "Please tell the detectives to stop wasting their time worrying about me," Rose concluded. "I am perfectly safe. The only people they need to be investigating are the ones who filed the false report." I stopped the recording and immediately forwarded the high-definition video file to Mr. Sterling. It was a masterpiece. No social worker or police detective on Earth could watch that footage and believe they were looking at a confused, kidnapped victim. They were looking at a sharp, intelligent woman enjoying a 5-star holiday. But the video was only the emotional component of our defense. The true devastation lay in the mathematical and legal evidence. Back in Boston, Mr. Sterling invited the 2 detectives and the Adult Protective Services agent to sit down at my grandmother's formal dining room table. He did not act defensive or evasive. He acted like a man holding a royal flush. He opened his heavy leather briefcase and began distributing the copies of the forensic dossier I had painstakingly prepared over the last month. First, he handed the social worker a thick stack of certified medical records. These documents had been explicitly signed and stamped by my grandmother primary care physician, a highly respected neurologist, and an independent psychological evaluator. Every single medical professional had administered rigorous cognitive testing just 3 days before we left the country. The results were unanimous and legally binding. Rose Evans showed absolutely 0 signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or diminished capacity. She was medically certified as fully capable of making her own financial and legal decisions. The entire premise of Patricia's kidnapping claim evaporated instantly right there on the dining table. Next, Sterling played the video I had just sent him. The detectives watched my grandmother's smiling face on the digital screen, listening to her clearly articulate the exact details of the trust transfer and the luxury vacation. They heard her directly accuse her daughter of attempted financial fraud. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted dramatically. The authorities realized they had been lied to. The frantic story of a hostage situation was a complete fabrication designed to weaponize the police department against an innocent granddaughter. But the final piece of evidence was the one that transformed a false police report into a major felony investigation. Mr. Sterling handed the lead detective a glossy bound report featuring my professional forensic audit. I had not just told the lawyer about the forged signature, I had proven it using the same rigorous methodologies I used for Fortune 500 corporate investigations. The report contained high-resolution macro photography of the fraudulent signature on the bank loan application side by side with 20 verified examples of my grandmother's actual signature from recent tax returns and medical forms. I had broken down the pen velocity, the specific loop angles, and the baseline pressure of the ink. The visual evidence was so overwhelmingly clear that you did not even need to be a handwriting expert to see the discrepancy. The forged signature was aggressive, stiff, and jagged. Rose's genuine handwriting was small, light, and marked by a distinct tremor. Then Sterling presented the ultimate smoking gun. He flipped to the final page of my audit report, which displayed an overlay analysis. I had taken a sample of Patricia's own handwriting from a recent grocery list she had left on the counter. When you placed the transparent image of Patricia cursive loops directly over the forged signature on the bank documents, it was a perfect mathematical match. The silence in the dining room must have been deafening. The detective closed the forensic report and looked across the table at Mr. Sterling. The narrative had completely flipped in a matter of 20 minutes. They had walked into that house expecting to issue an Amber Alert for a kidnapped senior citizen and secure a warrant for my arrest. Instead, they were now sitting on a mountain of undeniable physical evidence, proving a massive conspiracy of wire fraud. mortgage fraud, elder exploitation, and filing a false police report. Sterling called me an hour later while Grandma Rose and I were walking along the pristine white beach, letting the warm ocean water wash over our feet. "It was a beautiful execution," Clara Sterling said, his voice ringing with absolute triumph. "The social worker formally closed the abuse case against you before she even left the driveway. She categorized the report as malicious and completely unsubstantiated. You are entirely in the clear." "And the police?" I asked, watching a small crab scurry across the wet sand. "The police are furious," Sterling replied. "Law enforcement agencies do not take kindly to being used as pawns in a fraudulent scheme." The lead detective took the entire forensic binder. He informed me that they are officially opening a criminal investigation into Patricia and Richard. They are contacting the bank to secure the original loan documents, and they are pulling the metadata from the electronic submission to prove it originated from Richard's computer. I stopped walking and looked out at the vast, endless ocean. The profound sense of validation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. For 10 years, Patricia had controlled the narrative. She had painted herself as the tired, long-suffering mother burdened by a useless daughter and an ailing parent. She had used that narrative to justify her entitlement, her cruelty, and her relentless greed. But the truth is a relentless force. You can bury it, you can hide it under designer clothes and country club memberships, but eventually it claws its way to the surface. "What happens now?" I asked, feeling a gentle breeze lift my hair. "Now we wait for them to come home," Sterling said. "The detective mentioned they will be flagging their passports. When Patricia and Richard finally manage to scrape together enough money for a flight back to the United States, they are not going to be returning to a quiet suburban life. They are going to be walking directly into a grand jury subpoena." I thanked Mr. Sterling for his brilliant handling of the situation and ended the call. I tucked the phone into my pocket and turned my full attention back to my grandmother. She was pointing at a cluster of palm trees, smiling as a brightly colored tropical bird took flight. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a woman who had finally been given permission to truly live. Patricia had tried to use the power of the law to crush me and steal everything we had. She had tried to leverage my quiet obedience against me, assuming I would simply roll over and surrender to her authority. Instead, she had initiated a legal warfare that she was entirely unequipped to fight. The table was not just turned, it was completely destroyed. I took my grandmother's arm and we continued our walk down the beautiful sunlit beach, leaving the toxic wreckage of our past thousands of miles behind us where it belonged. 3 weeks passed. 21 days of crystal clear waters and absolute serenity in the Indian Ocean had worked a miracle on my grandmother. Rose had color in her cheeks again. Her steps were steadier, and her laughter was no longer choked by the constant anxiety of living under her daughter's tyrannical rule. We returned to Boston completely refreshed and ready to face the storm that was inevitably heading our way. I had spent those 3 weeks meticulously coordinating with Mr. Sterling from my laptop, ensuring every legal barricade was reinforced and ready for impact. Our return flight landed on a crisp Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, we were standing inside the quiet, familiar warmth of my grandmother's colonial house, waiting for the curtain to fall. I stood by the front window looking out at the manicured lawn. I knew their exact itinerary. They were coming. According to the frantic voicemails they had left, and the desperate emails Richard had sent to his baffled colleagues back home, the Swiss dream had deteriorated into an absolute nightmare. The hotel management had grown tired of their daily excuses regarding the frozen bank account. By day 4, the luxury resort had formally evicted them. They were escorted out of the lobby by local authorities, their 4 massive metallic silver suitcases trailing behind them like concrete blocks. Todd, the wealthy fiancé, had completely vanished. Upon learning that the family was entirely broke, he had packed his bags, left the resort, and officially canceled the wedding. Without the fraudulent loan money, Richard and Patricia were forced to max out incredibly high-interest cash advances on secondary credit cards just to buy generic economy-class tickets back to the United States. They had spent the remainder of their supposed luxury vacation eating cheap convenience store sandwiches in a budget airport motel, waiting for a flight they could barely afford. Now they were returning to Boston, utterly bankrupt, carrying a mountain of consumer debt and seething with a toxic, dangerous rage. They needed someone to blame. They needed their favorite scapegoat. They needed me. I saw a yellow taxicab turn onto our street. It was not a private limousine. It was not an executive car service. It was a standard, battered airport cab. It screeched to a halt at the edge of the driveway. Richard shoved the door open, struggling to haul his massive body out of the cramped back seat. He looked 10 years older. His expensive blazer was hopelessly wrinkled, and his face was red with exhaustion and fury. Brittany crawled out next, looking absolutely miserable, her hair unwashed, and her designer clothes rumpled. Patricia emerged last. She did not look defeated. She looked venomous. She stomped toward the house with the specific aggressive posture of a woman ready to tear someone apart. I could practically feel the hatred radiating from her as she marched up the front walkway. They had spent a 14-hour flight convincing themselves that this was entirely my fault. They were absolutely certain they were going to walk into this house, scream in my face, demand I surrender my savings to fix their mistakes, and punish me for ruining their lives. I stepped back from the window and turned to the people waiting in the living room with me. Grandma Rose sat calmly on the sofa holding a cup of tea. Mr. Sterling stood near the fireplace, his leather briefcase resting by his polished shoes. Standing casually near the hallway entrance were 2 uniformed Boston police officers. I had requested a civil standby, a standard legal procedure when executing a highly contentious property recovery. We waited in perfect silence as heavy footsteps pounded up the front porch stairs. The brass handle of the heavy oak door rattled aggressively. Richard was shoving his key into the deadbolt. I heard the metal scrape and grind, but the cylinder did not turn. I had hired a locksmith the very morning we flew to the Maldives. Every single lock on the property had been replaced with high-security mechanisms. Richard rattled the handle again, cursing loudly. "What is wrong with this door?" Patricia demanded, her shrill voice piercing right through the thick wood. "Just open it, Richard. I need to get inside and deal with Clara right now." "The key is not working," Richard grunted, jiggling the hardware with brutal force. "It is not catching the pins." "Move out of the way!" Patricia snapped. She began pounding her fists violently against the wood. "Clara," she shrieked. "Clara, open this door right now. Do not play games with me. I know you are in there. Open this door immediately or I swear I will break a window." They were completely unhinged. The facade of the wealthy, sophisticated family was entirely gone, stripped away by the harsh reality of their financial ruin. Brittany began kicking the base of the door, sobbing about how cold she was and how much she hated her life. They were a chaotic, desperate mess. It was time. I nodded to the officers and Mr. Sterling. I walked to the door and smoothly turned the new deadbolt. I pulled the heavy oak door open and stepped out onto the porch. Patricia's face was contorted into a mask of pure feral rage. She raised her hand ready to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse, but the words died in her throat as she registered who was stepping out behind me. Grandma Rose walked out slowly, leaning gently on my arm, her posture dignified and completely serene. Mr. Sterling stepped onto the porch next, his sharp eyes locking onto Richard with the absolute authority of a judge. Finally, the 2 uniformed police officers stepped out, flanking us and crossing their arms. The sight of the badges caused an immediate physical reaction in my family. Richard staggered backward, almost tripping over one of his luxury suitcases. Brittany let out a terrified squeak and hid behind her father. Patricia, however, was entirely blinded by her own venom. She did not process the legal authority standing in front of her. She only saw the daughter she despised and the mother she had tried to exploit. "You malicious little rat!" Patricia hissed, lunging forward with her hand raised, aiming a vicious slap directly at my face. "You ruined everything. You ruined my life." She never made contact. The officer on my left stepped forward with lightning speed, catching Patricia's wrist mid-air and twisting her arm firmly down to her side. "Ma'am," the officer stated, his voice deep and completely uncompromising. "Keep your hands to yourself or you will be placed under arrest for assault right here on this porch. Do you understand me?" Patricia froze, her eyes wide with shock, as the physical reality of the police officer grip snapped her out of her violent delusion. She yanked her arm back, stumbling down one step and staring at us like we were aliens. Richard held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, his face completely drained of blood. "What is going on here?" Richard stammered, his voice shaking. "This is our house. What are the police doing at our house?" Mr. Sterling stepped forward smoothly, retrieving a crisp, white document from his leather portfolio. He did not hand it to them. He simply gestured to the front door, right where the document was securely taped to the glass pane. "I advise you to read the notice posted on the door, Mr. Sterling," said his voice ringing with cold, clinical precision. "That is a formal property recovery order and an official eviction notice." Patricia stared at this paper taped to the glass, her mouth hanging open. "What are you talking about?" she gasped. "This is my mother house. We live here." I stepped forward, leaving the protection of the officers. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, refusing to flinch, refusing to look away. For 10 years, she had made me feel small. She had treated me like unpaid labor, and she had actively tried to destroy my grandmother's future. But standing on that porch, I was no longer her victim. I was her consequence. "This house does not belong to Grandma anymore, Mom," I said, my voice steady and perfectly clear. "And it certainly does not belong to you." Patricia blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to process the information. "What do you mean?" "We filed the paperwork. The bank said the collateral failed, but we can fix it. We just need Mother to sign the authorization again." She did not sign it the first time I replied, cutting her off completely. "You forged her signature, Patricia. You committed federal wire fraud and attempted to steal the equity of a house you do not own. You thought you could throw her onto the street to pay for a ski trip. You thought I was too stupid to find out." Richard let out a pathetic, choking sound. He realized instantly that I knew everything. He realized the police were not just here for a civil dispute. They were standing next to the victim of a massive financial crime. The arrogant stepfather who loved to lecture me about making sacrifices was currently trembling in his expensive wrinkled shoes. I looked at the three of them shivering on the driveway surrounded by their useless, expensive luggage. The neighbors were beginning to peek through their curtains, drawn by the commotion. Patricia's precious social reputation was unraveling right alongside her financial standing. "This house is now owned by the trust fund. In my name," I announced, delivering the final blow with absolute cold authority. "You tried to steal it, and now you have exactly 24 hours to clear your belongings out of my property." Patricia's mouth opened and closed silently like a fish out of water. Brittany started sobbing again, burying her face in her hands, as the reality of her cancelled wedding and her impending homelessness crashed down upon her. Richard stared at the eviction notice taped to the door, his entire posture collapsing under the weight of his failure. "You cannot do this to us," Patricia finally whispered, her voice stripped of all its former power. "We are your family. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life putting me last. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the clean, sharp clarity of justice being served. "You should have thought about that before you tried to put my grandmother on the street," I replied. I turned around, taking my grandmother's arm and guiding her back inside the house. Mr. Sterling and the officers followed us inside, closing the heavy oak door and locking the deadbolt. Through the thick wood, I could hear the muffled sounds of Patricia finally breaking down, crying in the driveway next to her silver suitcases. The cold Boston wind howled outside, but inside the house it was completely warm and safe. The battle was over. The house belonged to me. My grandmother was protected, and the people who had tried to ruin us were left standing in the cold, completely destroyed by their own toxic greed. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the coffee maker, and smiled. It was going to be a beautiful day. Narcissists never truly accept defeat. When you back them into a corner and strip away their power, they do not retreat into the shadows to reflect on their horrible choices. They run to the nearest available stage, shine a spotlight on themselves, and demand an audience. I knew my mother better than she knew herself. I knew that losing the house and facing a criminal investigation was only half the battle. Patricia, true currency. The only thing she valued more than stolen money was her public reputation. She had spent the last 20 years meticulously cultivating the image of the perfect, devoted, suburban mother within our local community. She needed people to adore her. She needed people to pity her. And I knew exactly where she would go to try and salvage her shattered ego. St. Jude's Community Church was not just a place of worship for my mother. It was her personal country club and her favorite theater. Every single Sunday morning for 2 decades, Patricia had marched through those heavy oak doors, wearing tailored pastel suits, and a smile that looked incredibly warm but felt like absolute ice. She baked cherry pies for the charity bake sales. She organized the holiday canned food drives. She gossiped in the fellowship hall with a cup of coffee in her hand, making absolutely sure the pastor and the entire congregation saw her as a shining pillar of grace and Christian charity. She loved nothing more than playing the noble martyr, so when the first Sunday after their humiliating eviction rolled around, I did not sleep in. I woke up early, brewed a strong pot of dark roast coffee, and prepared for the final act of this ridiculous tragedy. I sat at my wooden desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up the digital files from my comprehensive forensic audit. I did not need to yell or scream to destroy my mother. I did not need to throw a tantrum. I just needed a laser printer and a heavy-duty stapler. I spent an hour printing 40 copies of a very specific, highly curated document packet. The first page of the packet was a clear, blown-up photograph of the fraudulent home equity loan application featuring the completely forged signature of my 82-year-old grandmother. The second page was the official denial letter from the International Bank explicitly citing title, invalidation, and suspected fraud. The third page was a simple chronological timeline showing the dates of the loan application perfectly aligning with the dates Patricia had booked their luxury flights to the Swiss Alps. I slipped the 40 packets into a professional leather briefcase. I put on a tailored navy blue blazer, my favorite string of pearls, and a pair of sensible flat shoes. I was not dressing for a casual Sunday service. I was dressing for a boardroom execution. The Sunday service at St. Jude's always ends at 11 o'clock sharp. By 11:15, the entire congregation naturally migrates to the basement fellowship hall for coffee-powdered donuts and weekly neighborhood gossip. I timed my arrival for exactly 11:30. I parked my car across the street from the brick building and walked slowly down the concrete steps toward the basement entrance. Even before I pulled open the heavy double doors, I could hear her. Patricia's voice was echoing through the hall, carrying that distinct, wavering pitch she used whenever she desperately wanted people to feel sorry for her. I pushed open the doors and stepped into the warm, fluorescent-lit room. There were about 60 people gathered around the cheap folding tables, holding foam coffee cups and half-eaten pastries. Right in the absolute center of the room, standing next to Pastor Miller, and surrounded by the most influential gossiping women in the neighborhood was my mother. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Richard stood directly behind her, staring intensely at his shoes, while Brittany dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. I gave that girl absolutely everything. Patricia was sobbing loudly, clutching a fresh tissue to her chest. I clothed her. I fed her. I loved her like she was a normal child, even when she was so difficult. And how does she repay my decades of maternal sacrifice? She tricks my poor sick mother into signing away the family home. She threw us out onto the street without a penny to our names. We had to pack our bags in the middle of the night like common criminals. She is completely ruthless, Pastor. She is a cold, unfeeling monster. I simply do not know where I went wrong raising her. The women crowded around her were making soft, sympathetic noises, shaking their heads in theatrical disbelief. Pastor Miller was nodding gently, patting Patricia on the shoulder, and offering hollow words of spiritual comfort. They were eating right out of her hand. They were perfectly primed to view me as the wicked, ungrateful daughter who had ruthlessly stolen her vulnerable grandmother wealth. I did not clear my throat to announce my presence. I did not shout to get their attention. I simply walked across the worn linoleum floor, the steady, confident click of my shoes cutting directly through the soft, sympathetic murmurs of the crowd. The people standing at the outer edges of the circle noticed me first. The whispered condolences slowly died away, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence that rippled inward until it finally reached the center of the room. Patricia froze mid-sob. She turned her head and saw me standing there, my leather briefcase gripped firmly in my right hand. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock for a fraction of a second before the familiar, toxic venom rushed back in to fill the void. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "There she is!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the painted cinderblock walls. "Look at her! How dare you show your face in this church, Clara? How dare you come into this holy place after what you did to your own flesh and blood? You should be ashamed of yourself." Pastor Miller stepped forward, holding up his hands and looking deeply uncomfortable with the sudden confrontation. "Clara," he said softly, trying to maintain the peace, Your mother is very distressed right now. Perhaps this is not the right time, or the proper place for a bitter family dispute. We want to keep this hall a place of healing." I looked at the older man and offered a polite, professional smile. "I completely agree with you, Pastor," I said, my voice entirely calm, smooth, and completely unwavering. "Bitter family disputes belong in private, behind closed doors. But federal financial crimes committed against the elderly belong in the hands of the authorities. And since my mother decided to bring her fictional sob story to your congregation this morning, I felt it was only fair to provide the congregation with the actual documented facts." I unsnapped the brass latches of my leather briefcase. Patricia's face instantly drained of all its color. She recognized the thick stack of stapled papers from the devastating confrontation on the front porch 3 weeks earlier. She knew exactly what I was holding, and she knew exactly what it meant for her precious social standing. I pulled out the first stack of packets and handed one directly to Pastor Miller. I turned to Mrs. Gable, the undisputed head of the church gossip circle, and handed her one. I moved methodically through the crowd, distributing the packets to every single person who had been standing there offering my mother their misplaced pity just moments before. I moved with the calm precision of an auditor handing out quarterly financial reports. "Please take a moment to look at the first page of that packet," I announced, projecting my voice so it easily reached the back of the silent hall. "That is a bank application for a $150,000 home equity line of credit taken out against my grandmother fully paid property. You will notice the signature at the bottom belongs to Rose Evans. However, if you turn to page 2, you will see a certified forensic handwriting analysis proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the signature was entirely forged by Patricia." "Stop!" Patricia screamed, lunging forward and trying to snatch the paper out of Mrs. Gable's hands. "Give that back to me right now. Those are complete lies. She fabricated all of this because she is a jealous psychopath. Richard, do something. Stop her from spreading these lies." But Richard did not move a single muscle. He was staring at the red exit sign above the double doors, looking exactly like a coward, calculating how fast he could run to the parking lot. Brittany had actually taken 3 large steps backward, trying desperately to blend in with the beige wall and distance herself from the incoming explosion. The people in the fellowship hall did not hand the papers back to my mother. Human curiosity is an incredibly powerful thing. They looked down at the stapled documents in their hands. They saw the official international bank letterheads. They saw the timestamps. I watched their eyes scan the text, processing the undeniable truth, printed clearly in black and white. The illusion Patricia had spent 20 years building was dissolving right in front of her eyes. On page 3, I continued stepping neatly out of Patricia's frantic reach. "You will see the flight confirmations and the luxury resort receipts for a highly expensive trip to the Swiss Alps. My mother and stepfather forged a federal mortgage document intending to throw an 82-year-old woman onto the street simply because they wanted to go skiing and buy designer winter clothes. They assumed the fraudulent loan would quietly clear while they were out of the country, leaving my grandmother completely destitute." I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating truth settle over the brightly lit room. Pastor Miller looked up from his packet, his face a mixture of deep, profound sorrow and absolute disgust. He looked at Patricia as if he did not even recognize the woman standing in front of him. Mrs. Gable physically took a step away from my mother, clutching the papers tightly to her chest, her eyes wide with shock and revulsion. The women who had just been comforting Patricia were now staring at her like she was carrying a contagious disease. "I did not steal my grandmother's house," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady pitch that commanded the absolute attention of the entire room. "I am a certified corporate forensic auditor. I uncovered their fraud hidden in a desk drawer. I secured independent legal counsel for my grandmother, and she voluntarily placed her home into a protected trust specifically to stop her own daughter from stealing her life savings. That is why the bank denied the loan. That is why they were rightfully evicted from their luxury hotel in Switzerland. And that is why they are currently standing here lying to all of you to cover up their crimes." Patricia let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. It was not the performative, delicate crying she had been doing 5 minutes earlier. It was the raw, visceral sound of a narcissist whose entire carefully constructed reality had just been atomized in public. Her reputation, her dignity, and her pride were utterly crushed under the weight of her own documented actions. She looked around the circle, searching for a single, friendly face. She looked at her friends, her neighbors, her trusted pastor. There was absolutely no pity left for her. There was only judgment, revulsion, and the cold, undeniable truth. "You are horrible," Patricia hissed, her chest heaving, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whisper. "You are a horrible, vindictive child, and I wish you were never born." I shook my head slowly, closing my empty leather briefcase and securing the brass latches. "No, Mom," I replied quietly, looking her directly in the eye for the last time. "I am just holding up a mirror. You are the one who has to look at the reflection." I did not wait for another response. I did not need to hear another desperate excuse or another pathetic lie. The mission was completely finished. The mask was not just cracked, it was completely obliterated, leaving nothing but the ugly truth behind. I turned around and walked back across the linoleum floor, pushing open the heavy double doors and stepping out into the crisp, cool Sunday air. The sun was shining brilliantly over the Boston skyline. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling a heavy, toxic weight I had carried for 28 long years finally lift completely off my shoulders. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove back home to my grandmother. The satisfaction of justice had finally been achieved, and I was exactly where I was always meant to be. The weeks following that explosive Sunday morning in the church fellowship hall moved with a swift, uncompromising, and beautiful justice. When you build your entire existence on a fragile foundation of arrogance, deception, and stolen money, the inevitable collapse is never quiet. It is a spectacular, deafening crash that takes down everything in its path. 2 days after my mother tried to weaponize her loyal congregation against me, the local police department officially handed their preliminary forensic findings over to the district attorney office. Patricia and Richard were not simply invited for a casual conversation. They were formally summoned to the precinct as the primary suspects in a major felony financial fraud investigation. The International Bank, upon reviewing the irrefutable proof of the forged signature on the home equity line of credit, had formally pressed charges. Forging a signature to secure a $150,000 loan is not a simple family misunderstanding that can be swept under the rug. It is a severe federal crime carrying the heavy promise of mandatory prison time. I heard the pathetic details of their interrogation later through Mr. Sterling. Patricia and Richard apparently sat in separate cold interrogation rooms, sobbing uncontrollably and frantically pointing fingers at one another. Richard claimed Patricia handled all the paperwork and manipulated him, while Patricia, completely hysterical, accused Richard of orchestrating the entire scheme to fund his golfing lifestyle. Their united, arrogant front completely disintegrated the second they faced a pair of unamused detectives holding a stack of legally binding forensic evidence. They could not charm or bully their way out of the paper trail I had meticulously handed to the authorities. Their passports were immediately confiscated, determining them a flight risk. Their remaining bank accounts were frozen solid pending the full scope of the federal investigation. The commanding, terrifying aura they used to project over my life was entirely gone. In its place was the miserable, terrified reality of two people whose toxic kingdom had finally burned to ash. With the 24-hour eviction notice firmly and legally enforced, they had absolutely no choice but to pack whatever meager personal belongings they could fit into a rented budget moving van. They were legally forbidden from removing any of the expensive antique furniture or valuable artwork from my grandmother's house. They could not take the luxury cars because those had been swiftly repossessed by the dealership after 2 months of heavily missed payments. They were stripped down to the bare, pathetic essentials. I drove past their new residence once, about a month later, just to finalize the bitter chapter in my own mind. They had been forced to rent a dilapidated, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a notoriously run-down neighborhood on the very gritty outskirts of the city. The visual contrast was staggering. The paint was peeling off the exterior brick in great ugly strips, and the tiny barred windows looked out onto a noisy, exhaust-filled industrial highway. It was a massive, suffocating universe, away from the pristine, quiet colonial suburbs they had ruthlessly tried to steal from my grandmother. They were now surviving solely on Richard's incredibly meager monthly pension. Every single dollar they had to their names was instantly swallowed by towering legal retainer fees and the astronomical punishing interest rates on the credit cards they had foolishly maxed out for their catastrophic Swiss ski vacation. Patricia, the incredibly demanding woman who once ordered me to scrub the bathroom grout with a toothbrush, was now living in a crumbling building where the central heating barely worked and the ancient plumbing constantly leaked brown water onto cracked linoleum floors. She no longer attended her fancy country club luncheons. She no longer showed her face at the community church to gossip with her friends. Her precious social reputation had been incinerated in front of her entire congregation, and without her fake wealth to shield her, she was completely invisible to the world. My sister Brittany faced her own particular brand of relentless poetic justice. Todd, the wealthy corporate logistics executive she had proudly flaunted like a shiny, expensive accessory, had completely severed all ties. He blocked her number across all platforms, canceled the extravagant country club wedding venue, and sent a formal legal cease and desist letter through his lawyer demanding she immediately return the diamond engagement ring. Brittany was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing, suffocating weight of the massive consumer debt she had blindly accumulated. She had maxed out her own retail credit limits, buying designer ski jackets, pure cashmere sweaters, and luxury leather luggage for a fairy tale life that never actually existed. To keep herself out of a humiliating bankruptcy court, the spoiled girl who used to laugh at my sensible clothes and mock my hard auditing work was finally forced to get a real job. She currently works 50 hours a week, pulling double shifts making lattes and wiping down sticky tables at a very busy downtown cafe. A former corporate colleague of mine happened to see her there recently. He told me she looked incredibly exhausted. Her unwashed hair tied back in a messy knot, wearing a stained canvas apron, as she served expensive espresso to the exact kind of wealthy professionals she used to believe she was naturally superior to. The supreme irony is that she once arrogantly demanded I clean her bathtub before she left for Europe. Now she spends her weekends scrubbing the public restrooms at the cafe, just to earn enough hourly tips to pay off the staggering monthly interest on winter coats she will never get to wear again. As for me, I finally stopped hiding in the shadows of my own quiet life. For 10 grueling years I had played the role of the submissive lowly accountant, the free live-in maid, who kept her head down, swallowed her pride, and silently endured emotional abuse just to keep the peace and protect my grandmother. I had buried my brilliant career and my financial success because I knew Patricia would only try to steal it, or exploit it to fund her greed. But the locks were changed, the deed was secured, and I did not have to hide anymore. I took a portion of the significant wealth I had quietly accumulated over my corporate career, and I officially opened my own independent financial consulting and forensic auditing firm. I leased a beautiful, bright corner office space right in the heart of the downtown financial district. I put my name Clara Evans on the heavy glass door, in bold, brushed steel letters. I stopped wearing the faded, oversized sweaters I used to hide in, and started dressing exactly like the highly successful, powerful executive I had always been. I began taking on high-profile corporate clients, helping vulnerable businesses uncover internal embezzlement and secure their commercial assets. I walked into intimidating corporate boardrooms with absolute unwavering confidence, knowing perfectly well that if I could surgically dismantle my own toxic mother-fraudulent empire, I could easily handle any white-collar thief in the city. I was finally proud of my intelligence, my resilience, and my success, and I let the entire world see it shining brightly. But the absolute best part of my new reality is what happens at the end of every busy workday. I drive my car back to the sprawling, beautiful colonial house, pulling into the wide gravel driveway, without a single ounce of dread tightening my chest. The heavy, suffocating, dark cloud of tension that used to permanently hang over the property has been completely blown away by the fresh air of truth. Now the house is filled with warm, natural light with soft, classical music playing from the stereo, and with the wonderful smell of genuine home-cooked meals. This afternoon I am sitting out in our lush green backyard garden. The bright spring sun is shining down through the emerald leaves of the old grand oak tree, casting a beautiful, warm, golden glow over the stone patio. Grandma Rose is sitting directly across from me, sipping a delicate porcelain cup of chamomile tea. She is smiling softly as she watches a pair of bright bluebirds flutter around the wooden bird feeder I hung for her yesterday. She looks so incredibly healthy, so wonderfully vibrant, and completely at peace with the universe. Her silver hair catches the sunlight, and the deep lines of fear that once defined her face have smoothed into graceful contours of joy. She is spending her precious twilight years exactly as she deserves, surrounded by pure, uncompromising, unconditional love, absolutely safe from anyone who would ever dare to exploit her gentle, trusting heart again. We do not talk about Patricia or Richard or Brittany anymore. We do not grant them the power of our attention. They are simply a bad memory. A dark, turbulent storm we successfully weathered together by holding on to the truth. We just sit together in the quiet, breathtaking beauty of our garden, enjoying the profound, beautiful freedom of a life we truly fought for and earned. If you are listening to this and you find yourself constantly shrinking to fit into a space designed by toxic people who only want to use you, please understand that your silence will never buy their respect. Your endless sacrifices will never cure their greed. You do not have to be the permanent scapegoat in a family that refuses to value your worth. Sometimes the absolute bravest, most loving thing you can do for yourself and the innocent people you care about is to quietly gather your strength, lock the doors, and let the villains face the beautiful, brutal consequences of their own actions. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is as quiet as sipping tea in a sunny garden, knowing the people who tried to break you are completely powerless. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I hope it gives you the courage to stand up and protect your own peace. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Your incredible support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. Stay strong, stay brilliant, and never let anyone steal your light. Looking back at everything that happened, the chaos, the betrayal, the absolute collapse of the people who were supposed to love me, I realized something fundamental about human nature. Society constantly tells us that family is absolutely everything. We are conditioned from the moment we are born to believe that blood ties are inherently sacred, and that we must forgive every single transgression simply because we share the same DNA. People love to tell you that family will always be there for you when things get remarkably tough, but my story proves a much darker reality. Sometimes the very people who share your blood are the first ones willing to push you right off the cliff. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones actively calculating your destruction. For years, I sincerely believed that if I was just obedient enough, if I worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, my mother and stepfather would eventually recognize my inherent value. I shrank myself down into a convenient, easily ignored shadow just to keep the peace in that house. I let them treat me like a free servant and a lowly clerk because I was terrified of causing a disruption. But peace built entirely on your own suffering is not peace at all. It is simply captivity. You must never shrink back to please people who only view you as a disposable tool. If someone only loves you for what they can constantly extract from you, that is not love. That is exploitation. When you finally stop allowing them to use you, they will immediately call you selfish. They will call you ungrateful. They will confidently tell everyone who will listen that you are tearing the family apart. Let them talk. You do not owe toxic individuals your sanity or your hard-earned savings account. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the most vital form of self-protection. It is exactly how you honor your own worth and safeguard the vulnerable people who truly depend on you. Standing up for my grandmother and locking the doors on the people who tried to ruin her was the most terrifying thing I have ever done, but it was also the most profoundly liberating. I willingly traded a lifetime of walking on eggshells for a future built on absolute truth and freedom. If you have ever had to struggle against exploitation from the people closest to you, I want you to know that you are never alone. It takes incredible courage to break those chains and choose your own peace. I would love to read your experiences, so please comment your story down below. Tell me where you are watching this video from right now and what time it is there. I love connecting with each and every one of you. Please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss our next stories of everyday people fighting for the justice they deserve. Stay strong, set your boundaries, and I will see you soon.